Hi, Debbie.
Oh. But yeah, no, I thought you'd like that video. That's like, I was trying to get here. They do a little bit better.
Yeah. We got to see something. You guys. Yeah, I'm just like, this time of year always goes down holidays. And we kind of I want to keep that.
It's already begun for me. It seemed like last session was actually okay. It turned out okay. Having the numbers close, I think, keeps everybody. Yes. Unfortunately, it seems like it's gonna be a very contentious election year. So I think we have a lot of focus on those type of bills, which hopefully works out really well for municipalities, but we'll see. I know the school funding lawsuits is kind of throwing everybody in a loop, and so we're hearing from a lot of legislators. Yeah, I know it's terrible.
Our kids went to school together, so.
I graduated.
Okay.
Long time. Relative, did they fund your school correctly back then or not?
Yeah.
No.
Although 3,500 is much closer back than it is now.
Yes,
Right.
yes, absolutely.
We'll wait until you tell us.
I can do an introduction if you want. I don't.
That's fine, but we don't want to start. We're here on your time, so we can wait a moment if you think people are still trickling in or.
We're only missing one. Okay, she's coming in on one, so I'll see if the other.
Oh, moving up. Oh, front row seats. Front row. Can you see both screens? You might have to click with my hand.
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's fair.
So I can click this one here. Yeah. I can do this one if you do that.
No, I mean, yeah.
Not happy. I think do you have to advance it first? Now try.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Wow. You are calling order. Okay, so I'm just gonna call this meeting to order. And I'll just say Debbie is on, you can't see her, but she is on. I'm happy to introduce, Catherine Hack, who is the government finance advisor, and Dave Graves, who is government affairs counsel for the New Hampshire Municipal Association. Catherine provides legislative advocacy and serves as a resource for municipal officials and staff on a variety of government finance and taxation issues. She works collaboratively on publications and workshops for local finance officials, understanding and successfully responsibilities. Catherine is also lives in Greenfield and has been the treasurer there for 15 years. The most famous thing about Greenfield is the next they have a state park that won't be open this year, but we'll get a lot of people. And Nate is the government affairs council. He advocates for NHMA's 234 member municipalities in New Hampshire legislature and provides legal advice and training to NHMA members and partner organizations. It was routinely featured in New Hampshire-based publications focusing on municipal audience and chair of the municipal bar association. And you serve for that as a prosecutor in Northern Grafton County. So thank you both for being here, and we're glad you're here.
Well, I live in Concord now, and it's most well known for being next to Hopkinton. I greatly appreciate the park systems you guys have, because I bring my dog there quite frequently.
Well, thank you for having us. Neil reached out asking us if we could cover in a presentation the role of the budget committee. We had a nice conversation about what's going on here in Hopkinton, and I will preface by saying part of our role in creating a presentation is kind of to look at your website and some of your annual reports and see what's going on. I love looking at them. I went all the way back to 1934, by the way. That was exciting. And I like reading that stuff. And it was really exciting to see you're doing everything really, really well here in Hopkinton. You're working collaboratively together. You're bringing forth great budgets. Your community is passing those budgets. So I will have to say, before we even begin, how well you're all doing together as multiple committees making huge decisions, policy decisions for your community. So I think you should know from the start that this is really just to solidify probably most of what you're already doing and maybe clarify some of the pieces in the law, and then talk about maybe some strategies to consider as you try to elevate the ability to look into more complex financial tools to serve your community. So without further ado, we're going to cover the annual meeting and some budget 101, mostly from the legal perspective, your role on the official budget committee, which you are, and some of the other budget considerations that we're going to talk about, and some of the other financial tools. I will also say that at any time we recommend that you stop us during the presentation, raise your hand, shout out a question, because this is really a presentation for you. I think there's about 75 or 80 slides. I lost count. Our intent is not necessarily to cover every slide. It's to make sure that if there's an RSA cited or talked about, that you have a resource that you can refer to later. So the end of the presentation has a lot of the financial RSAs in them. So if we don't cover it, that's okay. It's not the intent necessarily. It's really to make sure you have tools that you can refer to later at some other point in time. If you were looking at something like debt service and debt limits, what was that RSA? What was the rule? It'll be in this presentation for you. Okay.
Comprehensive guide, because we know how it goes, and you're like, I remember them saying something about this. Now, what was it? And then you try to recall from the usual 40 or so slides. So Catherine made sure to make it very comprehensive.
Yeah, so it's in there for you. So in New Hampshire, cities and towns don't have home rule. We're operating by Dillon's rule, meaning we can only do what the legislature allows us to do. So in the absence of saying we can do something, if we don't see a law that doesn't mean that we can do it, it actually means we can't. So we can only do what they allow us to do and how they allow us to do it. So while we have a rich history of having local control and having local options here in New Hampshire, and the legislature seems to continue to embrace that, we still really do have to follow the laws and rules as they're prescribed. So this is the attorney, so I'll let him rattle off all the laws.
There are only a few chapters about money. So the main chapter that you're focused on as budget committee members is chapter 32, which is the municipal budget law. That's where you're going to find most of what your role is in the community. But there are a number of other chapters that you have to be aware of as well. There's specific rules relating to bonds and bonding. This is something that comes up actually in the legislature pretty much every year, where they consider changing those rules. So we do put out an annual publication where we give you an update of all of the legislative changes for the year, and I'm sure that Neil gets that and distributes that as appropriate. But we wanted to mention that as well. Capital reserve funds, non-capital reserve funds are also found in chapter 35. And then there are a couple other important chapters as well. Powers and duties of towns in chapter 31, and how town meeting is run in chapter 39. And then you also want to be aware that there are rules that are authority for Department of Revenue Administration, DRA, is found in chapter 21J. That's important to keep in mind because a lot of what DRA does is in support of municipalities or directly affects it. They do a lot of rulemaking relative to their processes. And so it's important to keep in mind that there's a whole chapter dedicated to them as well.
All right, so the annual meeting, the key players that we always have to focus on are the legislative body, our voters, the governing body, the select board, the school board, or the village district commissioners, and the budget committee. So that's mostly you all here today. So one of the primary questions we get, or why we come to these presentations around budget committees, is mostly to answer the question, whose budget is it? So we want to preface and cover this early on that the budget, it's a recommended plan. Budgeting is not a science, it's an art, meaning, right? We don't know the changes in circumstances that can occur within the year, but it's really the voters' budget. We're all here on behalf of our constituents, and it's their budget, and they have the final say at the town meeting. They have a lot of power and authority at the annual meeting to make changes to the budget throughout the whole process, but most especially at that annual meeting. So of course, we just always want to make sure that we focus mostly on the voters. We're really here to make sure that our constituents are getting the budgets that they want for the types of policies we want to see enacted in our community, because the budget is a policy statement saying this is what's important to our community and this is how we're going to fund it. Budget cuts there are some legal parameters and case law around Brentwood School District versus the budget committee, and that's why I brought Nate.
So what this case boils down to is essentially the budget committee can cut the budget, and because it's a bottom line budget, they can cut the bottom line but not specify from what specific lines those are coming from. And that's exactly what happened in the Brentwood Budget Committee. They said, I think it was like a 10%, they wanted a 10% overall cut from the school district. They didn't specify the lines. There was a legal challenge to that and said, well, you didn't tell us exactly how we're supposed to spend this money or where you want to take the money from. And when it went to the court said they don't have to do that because what we're actually looking at is the bottom line budget, and then under that, a list of authority for different things they can spend on. So ultimately, that comes back to how the budget's going to be spent, and we're going to cover that in a little bit as well.
Okay. All right. So there are 3 potential times that we can modify a budget. So we're putting the RSAs throughout this presentation for you if you ever wanted to reference them. So the governing body, starting when you start your budget process, certainly can look at the department budget and modify the budget at that point prior to submitting it to the budget committee. The budget committee can modify the proposed budget as you all see fit as a committee during the preparation process. This may be before or after the public hearing. So you do it all the way before, and then you take that public input and you still have another chance to modify the budget based on that public input, as long as it was disclosed and discussed at the public hearing. And then the town meeting, we go back to the voter. Ultimately, the voters can make any motion to modify the budget. They can change line items, they can add, they can take away. We will talk about the 10% rule that you all have to follow as a budget committee, but there is wide latitude and the broadest latitude ultimately for the voter who shows up to town meeting to modify the budget.
And really the intent of these statutes and when the modifications happen is to hopefully help direct the budget towards what the voters are looking to see as policy statements and as a budget.
So the town meeting or the legislative body, the voters themselves, they approve all appropriations. So without their approval, we can't spend money. They approve all appropriations. They vote to create any common funds, whether that's an enterprise fund, a revolving fund, a capital reserve fund, an expendable trust fund. They have authority to propose appropriations by petition that are binding. They may amend separate warrant articles to reduce or zero out appropriations. They may amend the budget to reduce or increase the total bottom line, and then they can zero out line items in the DRA budget form. So it's always important to keep in mind, again, that everything we do is for the voters so that they will want to support what we're bringing forward, or they have the power to take any of these actions. The governing body, so the select board's role in the budget, right? They prepare the warrant and draft all the individual warrant articles. They would pay all sums of money to the town treasurer. So why is that important? Because we always need to see all the revenue coming in throughout the year, right? Because the budget is a real living document that changes throughout your deliberations. You'll see changes if you started to look at budgets and you meet throughout the year, it looks like. So you see those changes. Prepare the manifest to pay all expenses, again, expenditures, and looking at what those, what's happening week to week and month to month. Helps you prepare a better future budget. The governing body establishes and maintains all internal controls over their cash and assets that's required by law, publishes the annual report, the general fund balance sheet, audited financial statements are required as well. They're maintaining all the records of those financial transactions. So the budget committee will have all the information as well as the voter that they need to make informed decisions. Annually, they have to review and adopt an investment policy. Again, that's critically important because in a climate like this, you might see your investment and your revenue going up. So I think from your interest income, so that's something that will become a consideration, especially in this climate, or if we start to see that drop down, that might be something that you are relying on, that interest income, whether it's your capital reserve funds or just your general fund. So you always want to know that the select board has to adopt that policy annually. And of course, that's critically important. Ensuring that all funds totaling $500 are remitted to the treasurer. So that gives everybody from the resident and the constituent and the voter all the way up to the committee members, department heads, assurances that all dollars are being properly accounted for, deposited, and put in the bank and recorded into the budget and into the software. And then, of course, most importantly, while we're here tonight, is submitting that proposed budget to the budget committee. So these are kind of the financial roles, really very broadly and quickly spelled out. It's more complicated than that, but of the governing body and how it would impact the budget. And these are all found in statute.
We'll give you kudos because we talked with Neil for a bit earlier tonight. And one of the biggest contentions that we hear in municipalities is when there's let's say a lack of communication between budget committees and select boards about when that governing body proposed budget is going to come over. And it sounds like you guys have a well-established system that has been working for many years. That's really key to make sure that everybody can do their statutorily required duties.
So again, you guys are doing a fantastic job. So there's procedural requirements for valid appropriations. So appropriations are the authority to spend up to a certain dollar amount. That does not mean it's taxation necessarily, because there could be offsetting revenues, and it doesn't mean what's actually spent. It just means it's what's allowed to be spent. So those are all discussed and disclosed at your public hearing, which the official budget committee is required to coordinate and put on. You have to disclose the purpose and the amounts at the hearing, including the sub-account information. And we'll talk about that little law change, but I know you're doing it because I've seen your documents online. You don't have a default budget. You don't have to worry about that. You budget on a gross basis. So gross basis budgeting is about disclosing the entire amount that you are going to expend, minusing out and including all funding sources. So maybe some offsetting revenue, it could be a grant, it could be a capital reserve, and then the final amount to be raised in taxation. You're required to disclose all of that information, both in your operating budget as well in every warrant article. So even though we'll say a cruiser is $50,000, probably can't get one anymore. It's probably $75,000, but you're going to use 25,000 from a capital reserve fund. So there's only going to be a $50,000 tax impact. The warrant article cannot say $50,000 to be appropriated, because then you don't have the 25,000 to meet the 75 through the authorization of the voter. So we gross appropriate in municipal budgeting. Recommendations have to be included. So if the budget committee recommends the operating budget or any warrant article containing an appropriation, you have to recommend or not recommend. Noticing the warrant, making sure that there's proper notice given for the annual meeting. And then listing all of the appropriations and separate warrant articles and posting the budget. So, and these are kind of the documents and the steps that the DRA looks for to make sure we've had a procedurally correct annual meeting. And usually we take the date of the meeting and we work backwards with all the dates that the DRA gives us, and we have some resources in the presentation.
I'm just going to mention on the gross appropriations, there is a process which your finance director is very familiar with, where DRA can look at, do a pre-review of your warrant articles and give you feedback. And often DRA's feedback is very helpful because it will not only say if there's a problem, but may give you some guidance about how you could consider rewriting that, even though they're not allowed to write your warrant articles for you. If you read carefully between the lines, they often have provided you some assistance.
So if you're getting very creative with lots of funding sources, and that happens sometimes in a community, they have a lot of different funding sources to try to fund something and move important policy forward. You definitely want to check with DRA and your local town council to make sure there's not going to be a disallowance from DRA that everything wasn't disclosed properly, right? So no spending without an appropriation, right? RSA 32.8. So it's basically telling us that no select board, school board, or village district, or any other officer or employee of the municipality can agree to pay any money or incur any legal obligation or liability in excess of the amount appropriated, right? So we really have to make sure that our budgets are as accurate as they possibly can be. Now, there are some levers that are going to be up to the governing body after the budget passes that they can pull, like line item transfers, in order to compensate for that. But the appropriation of money is critically important. So that would affect warrant articles. Yes.
What about if during the year we receive a grant that was not anticipated?
So there's two types of unanticipated money. So unanticipated grants that would come from the federal government, the state, or another granting source could be accepted under RSA 3195B as unanticipated revenue. I believe that you probably just received and are about to receive bridge money and road money. Those are unanticipated, so that you would accept them at a public hearing of the governing body under 3195B. They are not in your budget and they are not reported as offsetting revenues. So those kind of sit outside the budget, like those American Rescue Plan Act funds. They kind of just sit out here. In the case of the road and bridge money that you received 2 years in a row, and there's a third bill this year. So please tell your legislators that that's great extra money. I'm really, it'll help pass it. In that case, those dollars kind of sit outside the budget, and the law was very clear that they cannot take the place of the budget. They really want it to be, they are supposed to supplement. They want to be an addition to. We have inflation, our highway block grant, our gas tax, our fuel efficient vehicles. We're not seeing as much money coming in. So it's the legislature's way of really trying to help us keep our infrastructure projects moving forward. So that's one type of funds. Now there's gifts, grants, and bequests.
And you can spend those for the purpose for what they were given.
Right. Under 3195B. And then you have gifts, grants, and bequests. Those typically can be accepted by the select board as long as you have approved that at your annual meeting at some point in time, and I'm sure you have. They go to the trustees of the trust funds. Typically, there are a few caveats to that, but they have to be followed by the donor's intent in that case. So what was the gift, grant, or bequest for? So there's two ways to accept money, and you clearly have authority to do both here in your community. Once they're accepted under 3119, those funds go to the trustees of the trust funds typically. 3195B dollars can get spent by the select board at any time. Once they've been accepted, they can be expended for their prescribed purpose, right? Trustees, are you agents to expend on all your, so you're agents to expend on all those reserve funds as well. So if something came in, you put it in the reserve fund and you can then spend it on whatever the donor's intent was. The role of the budget committee would be to want to follow that and track it, because those dollars are going to maybe help you realize your capital plan. If they're going into capital reserve funds, or if someone left you money to repair the bell tower, because you have a great or clock tower here in town, that's a consideration for the budget committee as you were deliberating, and the planning board did its role in the capital plan, and the governing body's done its role, that those extra dollars are going to either offset or kind of be rolled into some annual budget at some point in time to move forward the policy priorities. So every dollar coming into the community and going out of the community is something the budget committee wants to be considering, but you don't have any authority over them, if that makes sense. It's context, right? It's context, but it helps you understand how decisions are made, right? So no means no. I'll let Nate take this one. Another fun one.
So if the budget line item is reduced to zero and the line item being on the actual DRA form, or the separate warrant article with an appropriation is either defeated or the amount appropriated is $0. It's obviously a financial warrant article. Then the purpose is one that has not been allowed. It's been disallowed by the voters. And so you can't spend money for that defeated purpose. Where this really comes into your planning aspect is as you plan your budget, you have to think carefully about what is being pulled out as a separate warrant article and what's being included in the general budget. So you might have a separate warrant article to, you know, buy a new police cruiser, but you might also have a increased maintenance line that's broad enough that potentially you could buy a new vehicle with. There's a concern that if the separate warrant article is defeated, that may disallow the use of that maintenance line to buy the separate vehicle because it's for the same purpose. So it really goes into the planning of thinking about how you want to accomplish this funding and making sure that you do it in a way that's understandable, not going to create a legal conflict. Because as much as it pains me to say this, you don't want to have to pay your attorneys more than you have to. So if you can plan to not pay them, that's always better.
And I think it goes to, we know your budgets have been passing, you do great voter education here in your community, but if you have an issue that's necessary, or you all feel that it's necessary to bring forward, and it's somewhat contentious maybe in the community, maybe at some point in time, probably not this year or any future, it's always good to keep this in mind, that you want to make sure that you're framing things in a way that doesn't constrain you and allows you to move forward in the best possible way, because we don't want to see a town without a fire truck or a police car or some of its critical, an ambulance, the critical public health and safety or infrastructure. Yes.
So there's a warrant article by whatever. And then also, you know, with CIPs, money assigned to replace.
CRF can't be used.
So now that money in the CIPs cannot be used. Money not spent, so you spend for for the next year.
Right.
Right. Not able to replace that.
Correct. So again, it seems like your community is very supportive of your budget overall, but the advice I would give in that case, at the annual meeting, on the floor of the meeting, if that's the direction it's going, you can qualify with the voters and have it put in the minutes. Is it the funding source they have a problem with? Or is it the purpose itself? Because sometimes it's the funding source. They don't want new taxation, for example. So if they qualify that, well, you can buy a cruiser if you don't tax me and use capital reserve funds, if you can get that in the minutes and amend the article, it's possible you could still move forward. But if that's not the case, then it doesn't matter the funding source that year. You cannot simply move forward, and that could be detrimental to a community if an article like that failed. So you have to think it's two separate things. Do they not want the cruiser, or do they not want to pay through taxation? So if you got a grant, would they allow it? So there, I think amending the article is a possibility, but you have to do that on the floor of the town meeting.
So just proceed. They go down in one article, then you say, you want to vote on this, or would you?
What?
Somebody make an amendment to clarify the vote before it happens.
The vote before it happens. So if you start to see that somebody's going to propose that, you would try to offer an amendment. Just in case. And again, it doesn't seem like this is something that your community is dealing with, but many of our communities do experience these types of issues, just for fun.
Yes.
Just for fun. Okay. Yes.
Sort of following along that, if we wanted to have a CRF for additional funds for those groups, but we also have a lot of money in the operating budget for those groups. The warrant article is completed. We still spend less in the operating budget.
Yes. Yes. Mhm. In that case, because it's not a specific item. So you have your highway budget sitting over here for the general maintenance of roads, and then usually a capital reserve fund is broad enough that it can accomplish its purpose, but narrow enough that the voters understand. So if they vote down the Main Street Bridge Capital Reserve Fund, they don't want to put extra dollars into a savings account for the Main Street Bridge. But that's, a capital reserve fund is a little bit different in that it's a savings for future expenditure. So that's not going to prohibit you. It's only prohibiting the savings of those dollars for that purpose. It's not prohibiting you from spending budgeted money on that purpose. But buying a new police cruiser for a warrant article is buying an item, right? A very specific item right now with dollars today. It's not a future purpose being created. So the savings accounts and the expendable trusts work a little bit differently in that sense, that somebody could say, well, we don't want to put $100,000 into that CRF. We only want to put 50. That doesn't mean that you can't spend any other monies that you've had set aside for that purpose. It just means that maybe they're feeling that's too high a number, for example. So the savings accounts are a little bit different in that way, right? Because you have a different purpose in the budget. They would have to zero out both of those things for you not to be able to move forward with infrastructure in that case, right? So, like I said, I went back to 1934. That was really fun. And then you guys have a very long and rich history with a official budget committee here in town. As you can see, in 1934, four people were on the committee, and in 1936, you formalized your committee. And it seems like it's the same way your committee's operating today. And I really was excited to bring you the total budget of $63,000 in 1936 that the budget committee proposed, right? So I think that it's kind of exciting to look back in time. Anything that you see in yellow throughout this presentation, you'll get it in a PDF format, is a live link. So if you want to read these town reports like I did, it was really fun. I would encourage you to click the link and go in. I went into the UNH archives to find it. It's really fun. All right. So the scheme of how you're set up is found in statute. So we know you're 6 members with 4 ex officio members. You have 2 village districts, a school board and a select board. So the RSA, when you were created, right, going back to 1936, you had to pick between 3 and 12 members for 3-year staggered terms. You had to have members of your governing body. So I think as you created districts, like your village districts over time, they got added as per statute. And you can't have any full-time employees serving on your budget committee. That's just for reference. So the mission under 3216 is kind of that is your mission statement in that law right there, RSA 3216. You prepare the budget to the voters. You confer with the governing bodies and departments, you conduct the public hearings, and you forward the budget for inclusion on the warrant. So that is really summed up very broadly on kind of how you were established, created under the law. And it's not uncommon in 1936. The law passed, I think, in 1934. So it's not uncommon to see a lot of budget committees starting to be formed around that timeline. Wolfboro, New Hampshire was also formed in 1936. So people started saying, oh, this is a nice idea for our community. So you guys go way, way, way back. All right. I'll let Nate talk about ex officio members because this is often an area of a little bit of confusion.
We spend a lot of time explaining what ex officio means to legislators. So these are members of a board or body that serve in that capacity because of their role on another board or body. So for example, the select board picks who they want to serve on the budget committee. They would also pick the alternate, if there was any alternate, for any board or body that one of their members is statutorily allowed to serve on. Those members serve as full members of the board. They can vote. This is contentious in some communities. They can vote. And they can obviously participate in the discussion and everything else that goes along with it. And because it has been contentious in other communities, that has been challenged, and the courts have been very clear that, you can't let them not vote or can't make them not vote. They are allowed to vote on anything that comes before the board. I'm guessing it's because it's Latin. That's why it's hard to explain to legislators, but.
So the benefits of a budget committee, why would your community going way back in time?
Question.
Oh, you have a question, sorry.
Yes, it is. Mhm.
Yeah, we do a lot of these. And again, you're very high functioning.
Why would it be controversial to have?
I noticed that the caption was the Hudson School Board against the Hudson Budget Committee. Perhaps there's some.
There are some communities where by tradition, the ex officio members have not voted. And they have since come to NHMA presentations and learned that they can vote, and now it's a little bit more contentious. There are some communities where they feel that because the select board is proposing a budget, that it's not fair because essentially someone from the select board gets to vote twice because they're also on the budget committee. Obviously, the purpose of having ex officio members is so that you can get the input and the explanation of why were these policy choices made in the proposal that's coming before the budget committee. Because standing alone, it may not make sense why the highway department is seeing a large increase and the fire department is seeing a large decrease. But once, obviously the select board member hopefully understands that and can explain that to the committee, and they can make a decision about whether that's an appropriate shift in priorities.
Yep. So, and I think it's complicated in some communities. I think they want to move forward their budget priorities. And when you see recommendations from the select board that's unanimous, or the school board that's unanimous, and then you see the budget committee having that separation, I think some people are concerned that it's not great for the voter. However, from the way the process is supposed to work, it's okay if there's disagreement. It's okay if those recommendations are not exactly the same and people have opposite opinions at the end of the day, because whose budget is it? The voters, right? So they get to make choices. So, but we can understand and appreciate that some communities are finding this challenging. We're glad you're not.
I don't want to get us stuck. I know you have a lot to present, but because
some of the function here is to sort of understand the budget for people. I just wanted to sort of zero in a little bit. So the ex officio members of the budget committee, it would be appropriate for members of the budget committee to ask those ex officio members to explain certain expenditures in the budgets proposed by the governing bodies, so that the budget committee can better understand those expenditures when they present the budget to the voters. That would be a correct role of the budget. That's what I'm hearing.
Right,
Correct.
because one of your roles under 3216 is to confer with governing bodies and departments, so you have that representative there to confer with. And that's the purpose, is to help facilitate that conversation and moving forward the priorities for the town.
And again, it's okay if there's not agreement, even though that's not the case for your community. It seems to be broad agreement. That's fantastic. But the law is, it's okay because it's the voters' budget, and the budget committees are really supposed to be the second set of eyes, elected officials who, you know, you're representing your constituency to come in and take another look at the budget before it goes before the voters. So it's perfectly okay if there was disagreement or questions asked, because the law implies the duty of cooperation, meaning we're going to cooperate with each other to move this forward and accomplish our common goal.
So that representative, it represents the department heads of application, of the school board member, represents the whole district from everyone that's behind, just like the select board, they represent all the department heads from the police, the fire department. They're the ones that are bridging that communication to the budget committee, and now the budget committee go into behind their back or whatnot talking.
So budget committees are allowed in every community. Again, we like the local control. They are allowed to ask for a department head to come. Some budget committees, while the governing bodies are creating their budgets, the department heads are coming in. Some budget committees are invited to all those meetings so they can hear directly from the department head what's happening. If some information was needed, perhaps you could ask the governing body or the, you know, town administrator to get more information. Again, that duty of cooperation is implied throughout the law. How you structure it in your community really is up to you all. There are some communities that have more direct access. Are really tiniest towns go more directly to the department head. They have a part-time town administrator. It wouldn't be possible to maybe get that information as quickly as they need it. Other communities really work through their governing body. It's really what works best for you to get the information you need to make informed decisions. But the point of the governing body person, the ex officio, is really because they've made the decision on whatever you're seeing before you for the numbers. They have made that decision to bring it to you. So they're really a really helpful tool to understand the why behind it. Because maybe that budget's already been vetted a bit by the governing body. Yes.
I just want to follow on that. So I feel like we talked about this at one of our recent meetings, and I came away from that conversation with the understanding that you could have used every community message. The department heads who were in the school, talk with us until after the budget had been formally proposed to us by the American body. And maybe I misunderstood what that's what was implied.
So waiting for the formal. So waiting for the formal proposal is following probably the legal letter of the law, but many of our communities, when we were up in one, they have joint meetings with the governing bodies starting in September. So everybody's hearing the same message all the time and they're able to ask questions. It's the governing body's meeting. It's still the governing body's decision, but that was one way that they didn't have to bring department heads back, because we do have to be sensitive that they might be hourly employees. They might not work at night. That could be a cost to the community. You're working on budgets, right? To bring that person back. Many times information can come through maybe a town administrator, a superintendent, or the governing body member can go back and get the information, but you really do have to structure it in the way that allows you to gather information. But the law does contemplate the access to information that came up through and how that budget got brought to you in the first place. So, but you just have to work that out for yourselves. But we also don't want to have somebody coming over and over, because again, I think there's a cost to that as well. So I think it's a balancing that we have to be sensitive to. And however you're working it out in your community, you might want to consider conversation, but I think formally, until the budget's delivered, it might be really hard for anyone to answer a question because they might still be tweaking it on the governing body side before they hand it over to you. So that might be why you're hearing they're not quite ready for that conversation. Yeah.
This is where it all becomes more of an art than.
Yeah, it is.
prescribed science.
It's an art form, and we don't want it prescribed and legislated to the point that by this date you must do this and this date you must do that. And this is who you can talk to and this is who you can't talk to, because every community is doing it just a little bit differently. And hopefully it's working well for them. So the benefits of the budget committee are the reason why, we have to think about why the official budget committee was created, was because you're another source of innovation, creativity, improve efficiency and services. You're looking at things a different way. Our governing bodies work closely with our department heads, and they're into the day-to-day operations. So perhaps there's some creative solution when we're faced with a budgetary constraint. If you're convinced that a proposal is meritorious and you recommend it, it helps advocate for that to the voter, right? Like, oh, we really do need this, the fire truck, the police car, the bridge work, whatever the case may be. So if you get that additional information, more information that the average voter would be able to get, that can help, again, move policy priorities forward. It's a place where you can ask additional questions, ask for more information, so that the budget, again, creates credibility. There's more credibility when people know that this has been vetted not once, not twice by the town, department head, town administrator. Now it goes to the governing body, now the budget committee. So 4 times this has kind of had to go through a process in order to get to us. And then the review of expenditures helps ensure that it's meeting the needs of the community. So it does aid in budget preparation. For many hands makes light work, right? So if something's glaring or jumping out, it can really assist the community in moving that forward. And it's a check and a balance. So you're kind of between the legislative body and the governing body as that check and balance for the community.
Yeah, and so just mentioning the review of expenditures really quickly, that's where you'd be looking at kind of those line item transfers that the governing body's making and saying, hey, every year the governing body has to transfer a few $1,000s from one department to another department for a specific purpose. We should probably include that in the budget and kind of shift some of those numbers over. So try to plan for things as much as possible.
Check and balance, the last part of the last slide. Presumably if you follow governing bodies. So the constituent comes up, the constituents come to the budget and say, understand the aspect of the budget that the governing bodies put together. It would be appropriate for the budget to sort of understand or attempt to understand that expenditure and portion of the budget rather than just saying over to the governing bodies, and that's what I'm.
So
it would be appropriate for the budget to understand.
Yeah, and this is again where kind of the art of the budget makes a lot of sense. So, for example, Catherine does all the financial stuff. So I actually got to pass a question off on her today because I could answer the very basics of it. But she knows more of the policy behind it. So I understand enough to get through it. But she's going to be the expert at it. It's kind of the same thing with some of those town policies. It may be the case that the budget committee has this 10,000-foot view of the budget as a whole, and they're looking at that. And then when it comes to the constituents saying, hey, why did this shift? Why did this change specifically? You undoubtedly got an explanation from the governing body at some point, but it might be something that's more involved and it might be more appropriate depending on the level of detail to pass that along.
I would also say in the budget preparation process, if there's a big question, finding the answer out and being able to speak on it as you foster and shepherd the budget forward would be critically important. But once the budget's passed, that really becomes a governing body role and how they delegate their functions to the department heads and the administrator. So it could be a timing issue too, where if they've transferred money, you'll want to see it. You'll see it in your reports. You might want to understand it, but the conversation as to why would really fall more to the governing body, because both the governing body and the budget committee really do take 30,000 foot views because we have day-to-day people running our organization and department. So again, it's kind of all a balancing act, but there's nothing prohibiting anyone from understanding what might have occurred financially. I think those are all relevant and important questions to be asked and answered. Oh, I'm sorry.
So. I get your answer, it's also very gray, so I'm gonna go a little bit less.
Okay.
Not just using an example, I'm gonna use the class size example from last year. So, it's really to me about what happens if the budget meeting feels like turning into a school board. So we have a budget moving forward. It's big, there's two questions. The question about class size, we didn't have a class size policy at the time. And valid discussion about the efficacy of class size as it relates to the budget. But in my mind, that conversation is appropriate for the school board meeting, not necessarily for a budget committee meeting when there is no set policy. And to have the discussion here, or the discussion, how do you divide it? How do you
So that, again, it is a challenge. So the budget committee's role, you're really taking the financial piece and making a financial decision around policy. So the budget committee does not set policy. That's for governing bodies to do, a school board, select board, district commissioner. They set policy and procedures, and the budget committee is looking at numbers. Again, where it's gray is how much understanding do you need to have around, in that example, class size, to make an informed decision about the budget itself. In absence of policy, the school board had made a decision and brought it forward. So if you were exploring that a little deeper to make sure you were making a sound budgetary decision as a board, as an official board bringing forward the budget, that's what the budget committee's job is. It's potentially important to understand some of the whys, but certainly until there's a policy, to your point, in place or a future discussion, it's really about the dollars and cents on the page, right? And not necessarily about the policy. So sometimes we have to separate out the policy from the dollars, but we also need to understand it all too in context. It's a little bit challenging in that place.
And one of the things you have to keep in mind as the budget committee is it is a bottom line budget. So even if you don't like the policy set by the school board, and so you choose, for example, to reduce the proposed budget of the school board, that doesn't mean it's going to impact the class size, because the school board could choose to fund what it needs to obtain the class size they want through their policy and make cuts elsewhere. So the question is more of a, okay, if we choose to do this, what are the potential costs and benefits, I guess.
So to that, I think that this is where it's gray, because in this specific situation, it was, please reduce the school board, please bring up a proposed reduction in the school's budget. The question then is, okay, they brought a reduction, like the valid question from the budget committee was, what are the potential ramifications of that reduction? The answer was the potential reduction of a fourth grade teacher. So then, to Rob's comment, like the discussion, like there was no policy to say in place what is the appropriate class size for the fourth grade. So this body had deliberations around, like, are we okay passing a budget that might result in that? And then there was voter concern, I think, the public comment brought to us around strong feelings, not attitude. So we, I think, struggled, like that was our area. Ideally, there would have been a policy in place. We don't want to create policy, we just reverse the policy. So this is unlikely that specific situation, I think, will arise again. But it's in, like, I think that there were differences of opinion on like this committee around like if that conversation was appropriate to be held here. I was on one side of that, but like I guess, how, because inevitably, like, if you take the school board out of it, right, like, let's say it was, we want a reduction in the town's budget, what might that mean? Well, it could mean we can buy a police, right, like, these will come up again, and I think that what is your view on, like, the budgets, appropriateness of the budget committee in considering the ramifications, like, specific ramifications of changes to the budget?
It is your,
So long-winded.
it's your job. So your job is to bring forward the budget that you're most comfortable with as a whole, right? As a whole group, a majority of a group, right? Because you can vote and have recommendations. And it's to bring forward the best budget that uses your limited resources as effectively and efficiently as possible. Understanding the ramifications of your decisions, whether you're adding money, right? And maybe some elderly person is saying, I can't afford my taxes, or taking money out of a budget and making a cut is part of the decision-making process. Again, don't write policy for select boards and school boards, and that's not the role, but you have to understand to a certain degree the ramifications of your decision. If you bring a budget forward, this, and this will happen, because the budget, again, is a statement of our policy priorities in our community and how we're funding them. So it's, again, it's all conversation, that duty to confer. Yes.
So, for example, we talked about, you know, the police cruiser, the fine, the police, this, you know, the police cruiser, not buying that money anywhere else to get that police cruiser. Probably speaking also. So what if we decide we're going to hire someone, but it's within our bottom line budget, and but they don't feel comfortable with hiring that position? How would that go under their jurisdiction?
So the bottom line budget, again, this is, we haven't gotten into this piece yet. Line item transfers are under RSA 3210. Once the budget is passed, it is the governing body's role, and you have to recognize line item transfers either through your manifest or through other means, a vote of the board, depends on how your community does it, but you have to recognize it somehow and report it so that each line is accurate. So if you've overspent a line, as long as you don't overspend the bottom line or underspent a line, it's so budgeting in the future can happen. So if a decision was made and the budget committee said, I don't know that we need something, whether it's an item, a good, a service, or a position, and that amount of money is not included in the budget, and the budget is we'll say $100,000. We know that's not the case, but let's just say it's for ease, and you cut it by 10% to $90,000. The governing body still have $90,000 to spend if that's the budget the voters pass, right? On anything that they deem necessary for a purpose that already exists within the budget, for a purpose that already exists within the budget. So staff, personnel.
So if I have $100,000 and during my hiring, my finance savings, I stay within my budget to hire a position if I feel deemed appropriate for the district, from the superintendent's recommendation, and it stays within that budget, and we don't exceed it, so we find savings by hiring actors. We're in the government part.
As long as it's an already approved.
Let me say something controversial. If you have if you have a generic employment line,
Yeah.
it is your authority as a governing body to decide how many employees you have, who those employees are, what they do.
School. Correct.
A governing body.
Any governing body,
period.
all the same law.
What you may see in some communities, I don't know if this happens here,
Yeah.
but what you may see in some communities is they will have a separate warrant article to create new positions. That's not actually necessary. All you have to do is find the money to pay the people you want to pay as the governing body. That being said, the communities that frequently see that type of practice often see turnover at the local level when they find that the governing body doesn't abide by what the voters say. I think that's probably as clear as we can get for you on this particular item. I understand this is very controversial, but I think we do need to move on to.
Yeah, it's a tough one. All right, so this comes right out of the RSA 32.5, right? So you're a budget committee, you're wholly within a town, so you have the school and the village districts. So you have the town budget, the school budget, and 2 village district budgets. All of them deserve the same attention, the same seriousness, and the same consideration of your time, energy, and effort, because it is your role to bring those budgets forward to the voters, right? Again, the law states that you can confer with the governing body or bodies, other officers, department heads, or officials relative to estimated costs, revenues, anticipated, and services performed to the extent deemed necessary. So to understand why do we pay this for that? And usually once you start to talk to department heads, you're like, oh, wow, your job is complicated, right? That's what I find. I could never be a highway person. I don't understand any of it other than the money. Conducting those public hearings and then forwarding the copies of the final budget is also required by law. We never want to miss this step. If you don't deliver those 2 copies of the budgets with recommendations and recommendations on special warrant articles at least 20 days before the date set for the annual meeting and post it, you could be found not in compliance, and your budget in your whole meeting would become like null and void by DRA. So we always like to caution that there's these really prescribed deadlines in statute. And I know Neil and superintendents, everybody probably keeps you really well on your course, but just
DRA and we both do
a calendar.
calendars. So
It's in the presentation. We'll give you a link, right? So your responsibilities for the budget committee are to review the current expenditures, review proposals, request information, prepare the budget, schedule and hold those required public hearings, forward the final budget, complete the 10% sheet, because again, on the floor of the town meeting, we can't go over 10%, approve emergency expenditure requests. So if you had to have a special town meeting, the budget committee is part of that. That is your statutory role. If there's ever a special meeting that had to be held. And then it's important to note the budget committee does not control spending. So once the budget is passed, they don't control spending. They monitor it throughout the year to understand how to build a more effective and efficient budget for the next year. So then that goes back to the governing body's roles and responsibilities, that they control the actual spending of funds. The 10% sheet, it's really just to make sure you have an accurate calculation. And we'll talk about the 10% rule, because there's certain things that aren't included in it. And you'd want to know going into your town meeting, if there was some legal judgment or some other item that would not be included. So you would know that what the parameter was in the event that the town started adding all sorts of dollars to the warrant. So the MS 737 is what you all fill out. I took this right from your website. The source is right at the bottom. And you sign that you have created a document that not only has select board recommendations, the governing body recommendations, school board and village district, but you're also have your recommendations as well. And if you've seen that sheet, it's the side-by-side sheet that would say, you know, the certain DRA account codes, what's in them. And you can have the same recommendation as the governing body, or perhaps through your deliberations, you have a different recommendation than the governing body. The point of this document is not only for the Department of Revenue to see what budget the governing bodies brought forward, but to compare it to the budget committee's document, and the voters have access to seeing if there's any kind of really debate within that allows them to say, oh, well, do I like the governing body's proposal, or do I like the budget committee's proposal? And it gives the voters a choice. Should there be numbers that don't necessarily match, which is okay, between the governing body and the budget committee. So we know that the budget cycle is continuous. It never really stops once it starts, right? From you have the town meeting and you present to the voters, and you guys do a really great presentation to the voters throughout. I've seen all your videos and everything you're putting on your website. So from the adoption of the budget to monitoring those revenues and expenditures, events, experiences, whatever the narrative, whatever's occurring throughout the year in the town, your committee is really following that from the financial piece, so you can understand what the needs might be in the future for the school, the village, or the town. And then you get right back to preparing that budget and having those presentations. So really, as soon as the budget passes in March, you can like breathe a quick sigh of relief, and you're kind of back at it, right? Everybody's kind of right back at it. This link at the bottom that's in yellow is a DRA technical assistance annual meeting manual. So if you want kind of more laws and rules, that manual is embedded in the PDF. So budget development, you guys do a great job. This came right from your 2023 budget presentation, right from your website. So you do a really comprehensive website for your voters. You should be very proud of yourselves. You're really communicating great information to your community, to each other and to your community. There's a lot of line item detail. I've read everything that you've got. I can tell all the things that are important to you here at your school and your town. But basically, by statute, you see I've highlighted the statutes, like department heads prepare estimated revenues and expenditures to submit to governing bodies, and library trustees can either submit their budget to the governing body or directly to the budget committee. But basically everything I'm seeing in statute that I would put in my presentation, you're already doing throughout your process here in Hopkinton. So I think you should be really happy about that.
I want to encourage you to keep doing this website, because we use you as an example in other communities.
Right?
And
Revenue.
we do in communities that see their budget not pass or see really controversial town meetings over their budget proposals. Oftentimes when we talk about them, well, what outreach do you do first? They don't have anything similar to this. And so this is critical, or a critical part of your education that you do.
So I think it's really important to note that, again, you're doing things very well, and it's okay to have some disagreement. All right.
And I don't know, now it's not. I just want to talk a little bit more about what happens.
Yeah, we have some slides on that. So we're gonna cover that a little bit more. Yep. So the uniform chart of accounts and sub-accounts. So a law passed in 2021 that requires now governing bodies to provide the budget committee sub-account information as defined as basically however detailed your accounting software is, as well as having a knowledgeable person present to answer questions. So that got codified in law. It seemed, I know, because I went back to 2018, I know you're getting the information here because you have a great amount of detail being provided to you just through your website, I can tell. So you're complying with the law, you're getting the statutory required information, and I would say you're getting details above and beyond that, and including narratives, and I did flip through your budget book. So you're getting a tremendous amount of information as a budget committee. So again, but this was established in law because perhaps maybe people were feeling like they did not have enough information to make budgetary decisions. We talked about gross basis budgeting. We're not going to focus on this unless there's a lot of questions, but we always want to make sure everyone understands that that's why warrant articles say what they say, and budget committees don't amend warrant articles. They recommend or don't recommend. They don't tweak them, they don't rewrite them unless they think that there's a major technical defect they might want to bring to the attention, but that is a governing body role. So important that you're reading them, understanding them, and they're doing what they're supposed to do, but not necessarily your role to craft them or to change them. Just recommend or not recommend. So we always want to make sure that all those gross appropriations are always disclosing all those revenue sources. Considering the order of the warrant articles, again, this is a governing body role, but in your deliberations, if something starts rising up to the top, making sure that you're considering that, because at your town meeting, if people start to leave prior to a vote and you had a very important warrant article at the end, you might want to consider that. And that is, well, it's a governing body role. We all get voter feedback. We all get constituent input. So we always want to be communicating and conferring so governing bodies know that perhaps, especially if you're using fund balance for anything, last thing in is the first thing out. So the last warrant article, if it's using fund balance and there's 3 of them and you don't have enough fund balance, the order of those warrant articles at the end of the year are going to matter. So if that's something the school might do, a village district, or the town, it's just important to discuss that. So if there's some discussion happening at the budget committee level, we have those ex officio members to bring that information back and say, ooh, should we consider changing the order based on what's happening in our deliberations? Making sure we're meeting all those voting requirements. It's always great for everyone to be clear on that. And then making sure you're contacting your attorney if there's a question about specific language, because they're with you at your town meetings. DRA can give some advice. We can give very broad advice as well, but we're not with you at your annual meeting. And your annual meeting, all of those warrant articles can be amended. So it's important that they're very clear from the onset. So problems that we always want to avoid is any change of purpose. So we can't change the purpose at the public hearing, right? We can't change the purpose. We can't change a police car to a fire truck, for example, at the public hearing. We can amend amounts up and down, but we can't change any purposes. We can't have any improper use of a capital reserve fund. So we can't decide at the public hearing that we're going to use the fire truck reserve to build the bridge, you know, because that's what the voters think we're going to flip flop money around. So always want to make sure. It sounds like you have agents to expend. I don't know if the school board is also agents to expend your capital reserve funds, but it sounds like the select board is, and it's been warned. You can't make anything non-lapsing from the floor. So if that's proposed, it's kind of a red flag. You can't have any warrant article be non-lapsing on the floor of the meeting. So that's important. We want always, everything has to be warned. So if you can't add a warrant article to your warrant after the public hearing, because it hasn't been warned, everything has to, anything with an appropriation has to be there at the first public hearing. You really have to be ready to go. Not gross appropriating, and then not having recommendations on special warrant articles, or not having some certain, meaning the voters need to understand. You can't have a warrant article that says, would you like to
Build a dog park.
yeah, build a dog park, and we think we might get a grant, but we're not really sure. Like, it has to be some certain, because there's taxation involved or no taxation. So at that point, that would either become advisory at that point. It would have no bearing to move forward with
You
a
can't
warrant article.
Calculate the amount
No.
and where it's coming from, you can't
Do it. So we just always want to warn against that. So any of those warrant articles would be more like straw polls, and then not necessarily anything that would carry any legal weight. So the necessary knowledge, as we started with, comes from RSA 32. So RSA 32 really drives how we craft, create, and move forward budgets all the way through the process, and how we manage them throughout the year. That's all prescribed in Chapter 32 budget law. When we talk about our town meeting, we talk about moving backwards from the meeting date. And then, of course, there's a calendar that we put out, NHMA, that's a live link, and DRA, because we always want to make sure, and I know Neil, we talked about this, he always makes sure a snow date is scheduled, because if, again, you even miss something, an appropriation warrant article didn't get discussed or disclosed, you have to have time to hold another public hearing. So giving yourself ample time, I think, is critically important. I know you have to the beginning of February, so it's not a huge timeline, but there's some time. So you want to always give yourself a week there. So those calendars are available because you cannot have any missteps and have a disallowance, because all the forms that are posted to DRA have signatures, dates. They have to be due to them by certain times. And that's how they would know that we were not in compliance, because again, that's for the voters' benefit. All of what we're doing is so the voters have information and they can participate in this process.
And I just want to note that on those DRA forms, just because you sign it doesn't mean that you support whatever the recommendation is. So if you're the lone dissenter, do feel free to sign that and not give everyone a headache by not signing it, because we get quite a few calls come mid-February about that.
Right.
So,
And your recommendations, if you are dissenting for some reason, or you're approving, all of those recommendations are, those tallies are on those articles. So your voice is heard through that vehicle. Yes.
I think there's a chance. To do those ones. There's gonna be a discussion.
so
No, you can't redo them.
no, technically, the Secretary of State could approve that, I believe, under the now existing statute for electronic signatures, but the Secretary of State has not taken action to approve those. I'd have to look into that further, but probably.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. I know it is a great tool, but maybe we'll see that come back in the future. That would be very helpful. So an official budget committee may meet year round. That's a question we get. You may get reports of the budget revenues and expenditures. So it seems like you're already doing that. So that you can kind of see what's really happening in real time with the budget. You can create a schedule for developing the budget. And when you feel like you need information by, so you can create a schedule for yourselves. You can hold those informal and formal meetings. So obviously you're streaming your meetings, you're having a lot of public input, you have minutes. So you're doing everything really just perfectly by the book there. And then, of course,
That doesn't mean you can avoid the right to know law. FYI.
no, yeah. And then, of course, mutually, you would determine information that the select board and the school board will be making available to you and how that's being made. That was the question that you asked earlier, right? How will that information be made? And that should be kind of ground rules set at the beginning of budget season. Will department heads come? Will the superintendent visit us? Will however, you're going to do it in your community. All right, that duty to cooperation, right? So there's no definition. It's just implied throughout most of our statutes that all of our departments, elected officials, everyone in the community is going to cooperate. Because we have all sorts of functions that cross over each other. Town clerks and tax collectors have to work with treasurers. I mean, we all have to cooperate. So it's important to keep that in the back of your mind as well. The voters and our duty to cooperate with one another. However, as I mentioned, it does not require a department head to come up with 50 scenarios, like what if scenarios, because that's time and money, and that's really kind of starting to get outside of their job. And it does not appear to allow a department or a board to keep anything hidden or confidential. So if there is information, just share it. But it's, again, based on what I'm seeing, there is a lot of information sharing happening here in your community. So whose numbers go on the warrant? The budget committee numbers go on the warrant, and the 737, as we talked about, clearly shows both proposals from the governing bodies as well as the budget committees. So the voter, in the case of a disagreement, would have choice, because that is the purpose. When are the numbers finalized? After the budgetary public hearing. So remember, we can't change the purpose. The voters can't come in and say, we don't want a fire truck, we want the police car this year. They can't change the purpose, but we can change amounts based on that voter feedback. We can say, oh, maybe we should put more in that capital reserve fund. Maybe our highway budget might need more fuel with the fuel costs. Well, they're going down at the moment, but I shouldn't have said that. Why did I say that? But maybe we know some, fuel costs are going up, for example. So,
but that's why we always encourage you to plan so that you have time for an extra budget hearing, second budget hearing if you need it, because if you get feedback, that's really important at that first one.
You might need to write and even have a new warrant article crafted, which had to be discussed and disclosed, right? But the budget committee would determine the final numbers and the recommendations to be presented after that. Your public hearings are concluded. So that is the budget committee. You would meet one more time, confer, discuss, take all that public input, and then decide on your final recommendations if there's going to be any changes, right? So that public hearing does have to have at least 25 days prior to the annual meeting with 7 days notice. So that's why it's always good to notice 2 at the same time, even having them close together if needed. I think you're already doing that based on what Neil said, just in case of even snow emergencies, or if the constituents came out in numbers and really wanted something that hadn't been contemplated or considered. And not finalizing the budget till that public hearing has been held is critical. So not signing off on any reports, like we're not changing our mind. The whole point of the public hearing is so the public can give you their input on what you think you're going to propose. Even if the budget committee somehow opposes or refuses to include a amount in their recommendation. So for example, the budget committee is opposed to something or doesn't want to include an amount, it will still go on the MS 737 form for the voters to see that the governing body wanted that item. So there's a lot of transparency that's going to happen throughout this process.
And if I present the town budget proposal, the select board proposal, and I get the deal next week, let's say, then the budget committee is very opposed to some item. Can I go back to the select board and say, I think to get this passed, you want to add this or reduce by this amount? Can I do that?
So at that point, once it's turned over, absolutely. Everyone can always continue to have conversation and agreement wherever necessary or find solutions together. But I guess technically it's the budget committee's budget at that point. So they would be making that change.
But there wouldn't be anything to stop the select board at their meeting from
Making a
voting to
change.
say, we're gonna send the budget committee a communication that says, we'd like to recommend you remove this item or something.
Yeah, at no time in the process is anyone prohibited from having discussion or changing their mind, right? At no time. Yeah, because it makes sense that something comes up and that's, yeah. Second pair of eyes is catching something, saying, oh, what about this? And then you go back and defer, confer and deliberate, so. Yes.
What about the process of the public hearing? There's, it's not supportive of the budget. It hasn't happened often. It's happened once or twice. And I think we've had some debate and disagreement over how the budget is then presented to the public hearing. So let's just suppose, the budget hearing. $250,000 more. I mean, typically, this board school would actually present the budget. But in the case where there's a disagreement, I put up the revenue process. I know the information is available in forms, but this is what that.
So it's the budget committee's public hearing at that point. So usually it makes sense for the representatives of the governing bodies to bring forward information. They have intimate knowledge of many, many details, but we've seen all sorts of different versions of that, I guess I would say, right? So some budget committees do the presentation because it's their numbers that come forward, but there's transparency that anyone attending can see that there is disagreement, and usually having a narrative as to why there's disagreement is important. Like, this is what we're thinking and this is what they're thinking, and that's perfect. That's perfectly okay to disagree. Because really it's about giving the voters a choice at that point. The budget committee's budget does not necessarily have to match line for line the recommendation of the governing body. When they do, that is helpful to the voter. But if they don't, there's reasons for that, and that is okay too. So the process is meant to be very, very democratic, transparent, and allow everyone to be able to speak as to why one is recommending one thing and somebody's recommending another. So, but the public hearing is the budget committee's hearing, right? So how you structure that is up to the committee as a whole. You would decide together.
I think where it's been tricky, but that makes sense to me, is that the governing body is indicating the lack of interest in presenting their budget, but never understand.
That's
so. We generally collaborate.
well, I've seen superintendents and town administrators present budgets at public hearings. I mean, I've seen every variation that one could imagine, right? It's just for you all to decide what will be most advantageous to your voters, right? We're not going to talk too much about emergency expenditures, but we did want to give you the RSA in the event you are involved in that if you're having a special meeting. So it's just important to note that, because we get that question a lot. Does the budget committee need to be involved? But we are going to make sure we cover recommendations and numeric tallies. So you are required to recommend those warrant articles with appropriations, making sure that your votes are counted. So budget committee recommends, it could be 6-4, it could be unanimous, but they are important to have on there. So you do, Olson versus Grafton clarifies in the law that only monetary warrant articles require your recommendation. So anything non-monetary does not, but anything monetary, even as a petition, would require your recommendation.
Yeah, and we should probably make a small adjustment to the wording on that first bullet, but yes, so obviously the budget committee concerned with money, the special warrant article doesn't have to do with money. You're not making a recommendation on it.
All right. So it made by the budget committee and governing body. So you're both going to make those recommendations and the public is going to be able to see that in the warrant. So again, if there's some disagreement, that's okay. It's part of when they're voting, they have that information in front of them. Only those special warrant articles, we don't need to print anybody's name. That's included in the minutes usually. So we get asked that question, does the names need to be printed? No, the names do not. All these votes have to be taken in a public meeting. We're all subject to the 91A, but you're doing all that. And then do you have tax impact on your warrant articles? You do. That's what I thought. So, okay. So the same concept is for estimated tax impact. So you have to include that as well. So this is how we categorize kind of our separate warrant articles. Anything special would be a capital reserve fund, a trust fund, a petition warrant article, a bond, and anything designated non-lapsing, transferable, or designated by the governing body as special. So I think that's important to note. We did talk about ex officio members, but I did want to just touch on this for just a moment. Because sometimes, do you have to vote in the way that your board expects you to vote because you already voted, or can you vote as a free individual? So I'm going to let Nate cover this because it's gray.
It's gray. Yes, so there's no clear answer in the law. Typically, it's expected that the member representing the the select board will vote in the same way as the select board, but if they choose poorly and pick the dissenter to join the budget committee, the dissenter could vote a different way. And it's really unclear about whether or not they can replace that person. Try not to be the town that makes the Supreme Court make that decision.
I guess that's going to be able to stay, right? You don't know what the board's gonna think of your motion.
You could abstain if you wanted to. I will tell you, because I'm obligated to do so, because my colleague Steve Buckley will yell at me if I do not, that if you are on a board, you should be voting, you should not be abstaining if you're in the board.
Unless there's a conflict of interest or yeah, you're accusing yourself.
Recommendations. So that they're recommending. Right, for the board members haven't heard the discussion.
Right.
And you don't want to put forward a vote representing them, that's what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay.
So disagreements, you asked about that, right? So we don't expect, and I don't think the statutory scheme in the 1930s expected everyone to agree. I don't think that was the purpose of creating a budget committee. I think it was for a second set of eyes. I think it was for voter assurance that more people were looking, contemplating, and discussing the budget, right? So disagreements should not really ever be the focus of what's happening, or the focus of our recommendations, our public hearings, or our town meetings, because disagreements happen within civil discourse. They're healthy and they're important for the broader community, that they understand that there's different opinions or different feelings on what should or shouldn't happen, right? So they should really serve to highlight and inform the choices the voters have. So again, it's perfectly fine to disagree because we're giving the voters a choice because it's their budget, as long as we're keeping that in mind. And we might be hearing from different constituent groups depending on our role, maybe different roles that we have in our own community. Some of us know different groups of people. So there could be all sorts of reasons that we're hearing different feedback from different constituents outside of formal meetings, or even at formal meetings. It depends if you're there or not present. At school board meetings, you might be hearing something very different than at what you would hear at a budget committee meeting. So highlighting and informing choices really should be the focus of any disagreement, if that makes sense. So the 10% rule does limit appropriations voted by the budget committee. That can't be more than 10% above the recommendation. So this is a check and balance on spending by the governing body or legislative body or both. So we really want to make sure that that 10% calculation going into our town meeting is calculated so that we wouldn't end up in a position where we have to disallow anything above that 10%, because that's what would happen. DRA would take the number that goes up to 10% and disallow the rest, right? So what it does is force everyone to improve their presentation, their justification for spending, because we know that people can't come in and just go 100% over budget or add millions of dollars. And of course, I did take this quote out of a different book, but it prevents tyranny by the budget committee by allowing the legislative body the freedom to change. So again, we don't want to just cut the budget by 10% because we know the voters can add 10%. That's not the goal of this, but anyone who stayed at home and didn't show up to the town meeting because they attended the public hearing, they would know the purposes, they would know what was discussed and disclosed, they would have seen the posted budget, and they would have said, gee, I have to work on, it'll be Thursday night this year, but maybe it was Saturday in the past, and I can't make it, but I know that it can't go up more than 10%. So I feel comfortable that I can't attend the town meeting. So again, we go back to the voters, right?
And we have actually received in a community the question about, should we just cut the budget by 10% automatically? The select board gives us.
No,
Please don't do that.
no, that's not the intent of the rule. It's really, the intent is for the voters who stayed home because they felt very comfortable with what was being brought forth. And even if there was disagreement in two different numbers between the budget committee and the governing body, whatever was chosen could not exceed that 10%. So these are the exceptions. We won't get into them, but we do know that this is why we want to make sure those calculations are available should there be amendments on the floor of the school or the town meeting or the village meeting. So we're shepherding the budget, and the final step is that town meeting. I just wanted to say that you're doing a great job with pre-meeting education. You're putting your hearings up, you're giving documentation, you have line item budget detail right on your website. So any member of the public really can follow along, whether they're at home or they're here in the room with you or any time that's convenient for them. And it seems like you're having multiple presentations that are being done, discussion, questions at meeting. You're having the budget hearings and that annual town meeting, you know, it's a little bit different every single year, depending on what's being brought forward. So the permissible forms of advocacy, it seems like you're doing all of them and doing them well. Again, you're doing posting on website, you're discussing at public hearings, other public meetings. So maybe information going back to the select board. There's a real narrative being created if anyone wants to follow what's happening throughout your budget process and your deliberations, right? I think you're even doing some handouts because you do a presentation. So whether they're handouts or they're PowerPoints. So everything that you're doing is within the permissible forms of advocacy to shepherd that budget along to the voters. So the voters make the decisions. And we always have to appreciate that this audience is varied and can be very different. Everyone comes from a different place, different levels of experience, different levels of experience within municipal and civic, you know, government. So they don't have the same time to consider details. With that different levels of experience, they have different interests, different priorities, right, as voters. But at the end, it's their collective will that must be determined and implemented. So always working backwards and thinking in your mind, we're doing it for a broad base of people with very diverse interests, very diverse priorities, needs, right? Is really why we're doing everything that we do in local government, is to serve our residents and serve them well. So I did want to briefly go into a couple of things that Neil asked me to cover tonight, like the property tax process. Why in the world do you guys want to know about this? Why? Well, because the budget that you bring forward equals property taxes. Yay. No. Yay. Yay. The tax that everyone gets that we all love to hate, right? So we have an appraisal at least every 5 years. I understand that you appraise at 25% a year and do your big appraisal in the 5th year. We have our assessments. Our tax year starts on April 1st. Very strange, right? So not calendar year, not fiscal year, April 1. The tax rate setting occurs in the fall, usually in that mid to late October, could be early November timeframe. And then we have the collection, the billing, the liening, and the deeding. That's happening well year round. And you get 2 tax bills here, correct? Yeah. So you're pretty traditional. You're getting your tax bill twice a year, once in June due July, and once in November, December due at some point in December, right? So this is the tax rate setting process. I made this fun graphic because everything that you do right? From the warrant to the proposed budget to appropriations, all has to get funneled up to the Department of Revenue Administration. So all of the things that you're being asked to do not only are important for the voters in the budget, but they lead into the tax rate setting process. So every piece of your roles and responsibilities really leads us to getting that tax rate set, which is critically important to have the money that we need in order to fulfill our obligations to our community and realize those priorities. So there's 4 taxes that make up the tax rate, and plus you have 2 village districts in your community. So we have the statewide education tax, the local school tax, the town, the municipal tax, and the county tax, right? The 4 tax rates are added together to get your overall tax rate. And then, of course, then you have the village districts, but they bill a little bit differently, typically, right? Twice a year also?
They do.
They twice a year also? Okay, so they're the same schedule. It's important to note that an increase in assessed value does not necessarily translate into increased property tax. And again, our constituents ask us that a lot. We get a lot of questions. How do we communicate that to voters? And I'll give you a couple of graphics.
Not as many as Neil gets, I'm sure.
Not as many as Neil gets, right? But we'll give you some graphics that might be helpful. And for an individual homeowner, the overall tax rate is multiplied by the assessed value of the home and divided by 1,000, right? Okay. So your tax rate setting, pulled it right off your website. Again, great communication is happening all over your website for your community if they're looking for information. This was your 22 and 23 tax rate, pulled right off of your website. You could see the percent change in the town, school, and county, as well as the village precincts. So you're really providing excellent information. As soon as the tax rate was set, the town is getting out this important information so voters can see exactly what the percent change was. So what you'll see on your tax bill is only those 2023 rates. As you all know, nobody's going to show you the percent change in dollars or the percent change in percentages. So you're doing an excellent job communicating that to your voters for better or worse. It's really important information. This is also information that the governing bodies, when they deliver the budget to the budget committee, and the budget committee needs to look at, contemplate, and consider when they bring the next budget forward, right? What was the impact to the community and affordability, right? All of those things that we have to consider. So the municipal tax rate in any town, New Hampshire, so this is not picking on anyone. I chose not to look at your last year and do yours. I just did anyone. We take those gross appropriations that we talked about. We subtract any revenues that we've received from all sources. We add in the overlay, which we can keep 5% maximum for any abatements that, right? Anytime the town has to abate taxes. So we make sure we're made as whole as possible. We add in the veterans credits that we receive, and that equals the net municipal tax effort. We divide that by the local assessed property valuation, and that's the tax rate per 1,000. So what does that look like? In a $20 million budget with 8 million in revenue, and I'm, rounding here, 4,000 in overlay, veterans credits of 438,000. The net tax effort is $12 million. So when we look at that, dividing by the assessed valuation, we get an $8.95 tax rate. This is a real town, by the way, just saying, not this town, but they have a lot of revenues coming in. So I think it's important to see how that works. And you can plug in numbers for your community anytime that you want. And all of this is on your DRA forms. So the county taxes calculated just slightly differently, but also starting with those gross appropriations and subtracting revenues. And that equals your county tax, but you're multiplying that by proportionality. So the proportional total to the equalized value against the entire county at that point. So it's getting equalized county-wide. And that's your net county tax effort divided by local assessed valuation going back to the local community. And that is your tax rate per 1,000. So if it's a $27 million budget, 14 million in revenues, the total county tax, 12 million 9. Then you have to get to that proportionality. You don't have that locally. You'll have that at the county level. Then we get that net tax effort of 1.9 million. And then we get $1.17 on the tax rate. So again, it's just really to go through so you can see how these all factor through. The school rate, it's gross appropriations minus revenues equals the local school effort divided by the assessed evaluation. So I think you kind of get the gist, but it is a little bit different because exemptions and credits only hit the municipal and overlay only hit the municipal side because the town clerk, tax collector, in your case, it's the same office, the tax collector, we collect taxes on behalf of all the taxing entities. So it's like a municipal responsibility. And then we have 100% legal obligation to pay the school and the county and the village district all of their dollars, whether we collect them or not, whether we collect them or not. So if we haven't collected some taxes and it's over our overlay amount of money, say, you know, instead of 95%, you collected 92%, that 3% has to be made up in good fiscal planning and decision-making on the governing body's behalf, so, of the town, because the school will get 100%, the county gets 100%. So it is an interesting scheme to consider that the town does have to handle all of that tax collection and perfect it, right? And perfect it. So state education taxes, a little bit different. Subject to change with the two recent court rulings, the Conval ruling and the Rand Swept ruling are both included here. You can click on the links and get the entire rulings. They're all over the internet at this point, but they calculate a set amount of money based on what they think they're going to need. That's not in the education trust fund and the statewide education tax. So 363 million, that's been the number for quite a long time now. They multiply it by the percent of proportional total state equalized valuation. So they equalize the whole state against each other. So the counties equalize against each other as a full county, but then it's the state, and that's the net state education tax. And that's how we get the rate per thousand. So everybody's is going to be just a little bit different based on their local assessed valuation, right? So those equalized property values before those equalized adjustments, right? We have town A and town B. We need those equalizations for the statewide education tax and the county tax in order to make sure that everyone is paying a fair and a proportional, right? Taxes have to be reasonable, fair, and proportional share of the burden, right? Assessments must be proportional. So we talked about that. So if you have market value of houses A, B, and C, we talk about how changing the assessed valuation doesn't necessarily change the tax bill. So this is a great graphic that could be very helpful when constituents might be asking, because if we have a total budget of 500,000, and this is just to be super easy, obviously that's not the budget. And we know we need to collect $10,000 on the, I'm sorry, we know we need to collect $10,000 on the tax bill. Each home is going to pay its reasonable proportional share, and it's going to go up together and it's going to go down together. So just because your tax rate went up doesn't mean every single property is going to change its value unless they had some adjustment. Maybe they did an addition, maybe they got reassessed, but it doesn't necessarily mean your tax bill is going to go up because we need the same $10,000 in the budget, right? So it's the tax rate that adjusts itself. So we see that in this example of property A and B, the total assessed valuation is $500,000. We set the tax rate, we need $10,000. Wouldn't that be dreamy? The tax rate is $20 per thousand. This is just to be simple. That's the taxes needed, right? And the tax rate will be $20. So property A was worth $250,000. Property B, everybody pays $5,000. Pretty simple. Well, in scenario 2, our assessments, right, they just went up. Now property A and B are both worth $275,000. So we have $550,000 of assessed valuation. So our tax rate drops to that $8.18, right? But you're still paying the same amount, the $10,000 in taxes. So I think this is always important also to consider as you're deliberating the budget. You're having a big reval year. Not this coming year, the next year, that this is how it works. So just because you have a reval doesn't mean everyone's tax bill is going up. It only will go up if your budgets change, right?
This is a great page, I think you've heard it, it shows all the towns and cities in New Hampshire and the tax rates.
Yep, on the DRA.
We're at $35 per thousand.
I'm at 36, so it's okay.
My question is, How relevant that number is, if you don't know when that town was most recently reevaluated. Is there anything on that, or is there a way to go and see that, so you can?
I have a handout on that because I always caution when people start talking about tax rates. It's totally irrelevant because if every home in your community is worth $1 billion, or if every home in your community is worth $4, right? The tax rate is really it's really to get to the budget number. So without assessed valuation and understanding that, the tax rate, you know what it is per thousand, but the per thousand can be wildly varied depending on, do you live on a lakefront in a lake community, or do you live on the top of the most gorgeous mountain community, or do you live in a very rural community with very little access to anything at all, and your values are very low and your real estate prices are considerably lower than that lakefront community. So I always caution when people say, oh, the tax rate, really, we really need to take that with a grain of salt, because it's your budget and your assessed value that really matter, because what one community can afford versus another, right, is going to be very different. And the tax rate is going to be wildly varied, right? One community has a $4 tax rate, but they have a $10 million budget. But so right. So I think it's that sheet without those valuation, right? It's a little bit misleading, I guess you could say. I don't love being in the top 6 right now in my community, I have to tell you.
And the equalization rates will come out in January or February, and those rates you could use to compare, but you really can't, especially us, we're in year 5. And we all know how property rates have gone. So right now, we're assessed at probably 50 or 60% of the real values. So if it's 50%, cut our tax rate in half, and that's the comparable number.
But even if you cut the tax rate in half, if the budget doesn't change, the tax bill won't change. So I think that, like, to Neil's point, some of this information comes out at different times. And it needs to be considered as a whole, and it's a whole discussion. Yes.
Are there other ways that you recommend tools that you want to spending? So I think, like, for the schools, we want to do that, but we can spend comparison. We might say we even about that for average, middle of the road expense. That's a helpful benchmark. Is there something similar on the municipal side?
I have a slide on that. I have a slide on everything, but yeah, I have a slide. I have a slide on everything. Yeah, I teach classes all day long on these kinds of things, but that's my favorite, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit about effective budgeting, and we don't have like a firm time or anything, but we know we want to be respectful of everyone's time. But we want to point out that government budgets are counter-cyclical, and what that means is that the demand for public services will go up when we see inflation or cost increases or the economy slows. So either inflation, and people will want more for their money. Maybe they can't afford to go to the movies anymore. They want more recreation. Maybe they have more need in the community, but it's counterintuitive. But what that means is that we have to do more with less money, because you can't tax them necessarily more, but the demands for services will go up. And we definitely have experienced that through inflation, for example, right? Everything has gone up. So it's certainly challenging. So always looking at our fiscal capacity and what we should able to consider. We'll talk a little bit more about fiscal capacity in the budget process, which everybody at every level needs to consider in a community, right? So establishing that baseline budget, again, super excited to see that you guys are talking about this right in your last year's chart. Your governing body said they wanted to maintain the current level of services, minimize the effects of inflation, and retain well-qualified staff. So you asked for a level services budget. So level services budgets will deliver the same services in the next year, but there's cost to that, right? Because you're not doing a level funded budget. It allows your government to analyze the cost of delivering services year over year, but it can be challenging to project increases of goods and services, right? That is a huge challenge, especially in the inflationary environment we just experienced. And it may not respond to changes in priorities, for example. So, because you're providing basically, these are the services we're providing. The level funded budget is also very common. It's same amount of money, right, from last year to this year, maybe makes cuts around the margins, does not necessarily deliver the same services, because how could it if we have the inflation that we have? Due to rising costs, it really does create cuts in services or cuts, maybe deferred maintenance. It's some kind of cuts are going to result. Decreases in revenue also could result in cuts, which our level services budget takes into account any decrease in revenue, and it tends to be very inflexible. Common practice is to kind of look and just tweak around the margins, right? Any budget. So the traditional budget method is really making those incremental line item budgeting changes using last year's numbers and kind of modifying the margins, not necessarily the most effective way to budget. It's useful when we're very economically stable, which we're not necessarily at the moment, but it's really slow to adapt to changing conditions if we never really look carefully at those lines and the services we want to be providing. So some strategies that I recommend are zero-based budgeting, building budgets from the ground up, not trying to do that with the whole town or the whole school at once, maybe one department, one segment of a budget, right, at a time, right, chunk it out. It could be the governing body that takes us on, a department head, it could be the budget committee, but that really does help decide that some line item that we have in the budget, like pencils and paper, I'm on a school board, starting to become almost an irrelevant, it's an important line, we still have it, we still need pencils and paper, but it's not the line it used to be. Same with the copiers, same with the, but now we need Chromebooks, right? That's an example. So we want to be able to respond to that complete change in how we're delivering education, right? Priority-based budgeting is a model that we're building on the budget around the community's priorities. So we're like, what's important to us? And let's make sure we're funding it. I used to be a private consultant. I would go into a community, they would give me their budget documents and they would tell me, our parks are the most important thing to us. I'm like, but it's not even 0.1% of your entire budget. So I know it's important to you emotionally, but if you want to improve the condition of your park, you have to put dollars, right? Put dollars there. So that's just an example. Performance-based budgeting often happens, on a school board where you're budgeting for outcomes. So you're using performance-based measures to measure outputs. Can also do that in places where you have revolving funds, transfer stations. If you're operating an ambulance service, that can be performance-based budgeted as well. So usually we can take a lot of these different methods and kind of mush them together, and for each department or each area of the budget we're considering, use the right tool for the right job, right? But again, I would not recommend trying to build a zero-based budget for the entire town or school in year one. Revenue analysis. While the budget committee can certainly look at revenue, and it's critical that we listen to what the governing body and like the town clerk, we look at historical information is bringing in. When we set a budget, our revenue matters, right? The more revenue are coming in, we talked about that state aid and that unanticipated revenue, that's a conversation, right? Oh, we were able to complete our road plan even in inflation because we got this extra payment. So now we don't need to worry about it next year. So I think it's important to always be tracking and looking at revenue. Federal and state revenue can be varied, right? They ebb and flow and dip and go up and down. Hard to track. So it's really important that we're always checking on our revenue because that's going to impact the tax rate, right? Less revenue, more tax, right? It also will gauge the sustainability of policies and programs. So if you are a village district, if you are a revenue generating facility, ambulance service, transfer station, anything that has fees, charges for services, it's a governing body, looks at those carefully and just makes sure that they're commensurate with your cost recovery goals, right? So if you want something to be paid for 100% by a fee, say a recreation program, you probably can't have the same fee you had in 2020 or 2001, right? You have to honestly be looking and carefully at those revenue generating opportunities and whether or not they're meeting what the governing body intended. And that information is then conveyed to again, not a budget committee role, but important to understand that maybe the governing body just adjusted a fee to be more accurate for those cost recovery goals, right? So that's important to note that they anticipate more revenue coming into that line, and that's the narrative as to why.
So we encourage that governing bodies look at those at least once a year, just because we do see those changes pretty frequently.
Right, especially with inflation. And your cost recovery goals can change over time, your priorities can change over time, so it is important. And you do have to have a public hearing to change fees as a governing body. Just so you know. Revenue sources, we talked quickly. We have education funding, which is really a wild card right now. We have the highway block grant, which we know has been decreasing. This again this little revenue chart comes right from your presentation last year. So fantastic. You're really looking at what you're thinking you're going to get. Our meals and rooms has been increasing year over year because we have a new formula that was enacted. So that is unrestricted revenue that's reported to the DRA, but is not attached to any specific purpose. It just directly offsets property tax. And then you have all of these different municipal revenues, and those are the types of things we need to be looking at throughout the year. So when it comes to budget season, we're capturing the revenue that we anticipate capturing, or we plan for a loss of revenue due to unforeseen circumstances. Town clerks, for example, register our motor vehicles. We know motor vehicles, while they've gone up in price, it does increase registrations. If people can't afford those new vehicles, what's the largest amount of money coming in? The new vehicle. A 20-year-old vehicle is not bringing in a whole lot of revenue. So if people aren't buying new cars in your community and registering them, and town clerk revenue's down, that's general fund revenue. It is a stable revenue. It's usually 12 to 18% of the revenue coming in. It comes in every month. Taxes come in twice a year. It helps with cash flow. Those are things that we have to look at. Where's town clerk revenue coming in at? I've heard a couple of towns that are down. Their large fleets aren't getting renewed or bought as quickly. They're making do with older vehicles because of cost. So all of these things really do matter when we're setting the tax rate, right? Expenditure analysis, right? So looking at the right indices for the right job. I always like to talk about this because everyone's like CPI, CPI, CPI. CPI is great for cost of living and COLAs. Not great for education. There's an education price index that's out there, EPI. There's a construction price index. So if you're doing a large construction job from the US Department of Commerce, there is a producer price index, so price of commodities. So that's also important to check out. And then at the bottom, the municipal cost index. The American City and County Magazine puts this together. You can sign up for it. Well, anyone can. You put in your name and your email. They don't really bother you too often if you opt out of everything. And they put all the indices together onto one sheet so you can see costs. So you want to use the right tool for the right job. So if you have a large construction project, don't look at CPI, not the right tool. But for COLAs and our salaries, that is what we want to look at because that's the buying power for our employees. So I think that's critically important for expenditure analyses. So again, as the budget committee and the governing bodies are deliberating the budget and deciding, and you're looking for those narratives, these are some of the tools. Yes.
Talked to people at MCI a couple of weeks ago. Mark and I were conversing about what that's used. The problem with their index is they're using somebody else's formula and they're not using out anything from CPI or PPI. It's just a whole basket. So they've got a whole bunch of stuff in there. So it seems like no one has a really good sense as to what that actually measuring or the basket is.
When you just see the MCI number.
Right.
Right. But then they do break it out to all the different categories.
Whatever the one I spoke to, they say CPI number, and the construction price index, put them all together. So everything that's in those baskets goes into that index. So for a town, you're not buying, shirts, you're not buying clothing, all of those things, still in the basket.
But you're paying employees.
I understand, but if you're trying to calculate increases in municipal budgets based on that, you're measuring a whole bunch of things that towns and schools don't have.
So we could probably have an offline conversation because I do have the back end formula for how it's calculated. Yeah, I'm happy to share it. I did spend 20 years on Wall Street, so I know how they came to that number. And the indices don't just simply always add up to make that indices number. And municipalities tend to pay more right? For a lot of goods and services, because we are very niche, right? Very niche. Fire trucks. Who else is buying those? I mean, can you find me someone other than a city or town that's buying a fire truck? Nobody. Police radios, right? Transfer station, almost, there's some, I suppose, privately operated in the world, but those compactors, all of those things, ambulances. I mean, there's a few private companies, but we end up in a place where the market's cornered to government, right? And government meets its obligations, right? Because we just tax more when we have to. So I'm happy to talk to you offline about that, but you can go to each individual indices if you're more comfortable looking for each project. And I recommend doing that so that you're really looking at, if you're in education, don't look at the right thing. But if you're doing a major school project, look at the construction price index, right? So we're looking at the right tool for the right job. Right. So ranking and prioritizing expenditures, much like our capital plan, and you has a robust 20-year excellent capital plan in your community. You do a great job figuring out what your needs are today, tomorrow, and well into the future. The prices certainly will change. A capital plan is going to change, but you do a great job around that. So even when we budget, though, within a year, the operating budget and the capital budget really do intertwine every single year when we create the budget. We want to make sure we're ranking and prioritizing expenditures. So if we do ever have to make a choice, if it's health, public safety required by law, for example, we're making sure that those are met before we perhaps build a new park space, which is important and wonderful and critical to a community, but it might not be required by law, for example. So when we do that and we rank and prioritize, if the budget is starting to get tight, or ask department heads, ask governing bodies, what is the most important thing? What rises to the top? If we have to make hard choices, sometimes those rank and prioritized expenditures coming in from the front side really help us in our decision making throughout the process, right? The existing capital plan, schools, towns, village districts, we all have those existing plans, and they really do provide the information we need because we have to include that in our budget. It's part of the tax bill. It's going to be part of the big picture, right? The capital plan, we're including that. Some will be in the operating budget, some will be separate warrant articles. It really will depend, right? So the CIP and the operating budget, they really do go together. Because again, as you're developing the operating budget, pieces of your capital plan every year have to be included in your warrant. So whether you do bond, pay as you go, grants, fees, public-private partnerships, there's so many ways to fund them, but that all has to be considered every single year when we go through the process. So when we see these capital items, how are we paying for it? What, are we saving ahead and we've put enough money in the bank? Or do we need to bond whatever it is we're doing, right? So this is your amazing capital plan right here. So I just wanted to point that out. Did you have something to add?
Oh, I was going to say, one of the nice things that you guys do is you plan out 20 years, as Catherine mentioned earlier. She considers 6 years, which is the statutory amount at the minimum. And the good news with planning out so far is you can really take advantage of particularly federal dollars when they become available and shift priorities around a lot more effectively than 6 years.
Right. So I think you're doing an excellent job identifying what your needs are in your community and when the timing might be. And again, this is all subject to change. It's an art and not a science, right? And that is okay. I always like to give Durham's capital plan. It's really one of the best capital plans I've seen in New Hampshire. And what I highlight about this is not only does it plan out a number of years, so you could, it's not meant to be readable 24, 25, 26, 27, but it identifies it. If you go across the top, you see the description, you see the funding source, and you see the total. So for the fire department, you go across the top and you see the total. And then as you go through, it tells you the funding source, and it goes out a number of years on how they think they're going to fund it. So they can meet capital reserve targets. This is Durham's a big community, but doesn't mean our small communities can't use tools like this. It really ties a funding plan or a potential funding plan subject to change, of course, to the capital improvement plan so that in those years, that if I haven't saved $25,000 a year in my CRF, I'm not going to be able to buy that fire truck accounting for inflation. So this is just a way, because I think that, again, you're very high functioning here. You might be able to elevate even your capital plan and tie it just probably in a 3-year span. You know, this wouldn't go out 20 years. That would not be realistic, but maybe in 3 or 5, so you can see, because you do have really robust capital reserve funds here. You're saving, you have targets. So you could consider a model like this perhaps, because it makes it picture perfectly clear on how you're getting from A to B on the budget side. Schools can do this as well.
We do.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's fantastic to have these kinds of plans, because we need them. Now, fiscal capacity, I always say, who cares about it? Everybody. Everybody cares, whether you're a taxpayer or ratepayer, investors who buy our bonds, if we ever go to bonds, rating agencies, our management, our municipal managers care about it, and our elected officials. So what is fiscal capacity and our fiscal condition? So after you analyze your revenue and before you do your expenditures, it's always important to look at information. For example, click on New Hampshire Community Profiles and look up at your community. If you're tracking this over time, you can see if there's been changes in your community on demographics, if there's been changes in income, changes in all sorts of information that might be helpful. Who is moving in here? Is it an older population? Is it a younger population, right? Because that's going to maybe talk to schools a little bit more. Is there median household income? This is 2020s. You can click there. That's most recent from the Census Bureau, but is it going up or down? And when we start tracking this over time, we can start to see what's happening in our community. And one of the communities we did this exercise with, she couldn't believe how much their median household income went up, how big the population growth was in their community, and the huge demographic change as a result of COVID-19, who was coming to the community. So they were making decisions based on kind of like old information. She went back 5 years, started tracking it, and that it was a tremendous change. So we really want to understand the environmental factors, organizational factors, the actions and decisions of our government. What is our capacity to basically raise taxes and increase budgets? Because that's our job, right? And if we want to provide services, are revenues increasing or decreasing? What's our debt structure look like at the moment? Do we have poor conditioned, buildings? Do we have major projects coming that the community can or can't afford? So kind of looking at some of these markers in the community over time is quite fascinating, including my own community. I could not believe our median household income went up by $12,000 in 3 years in little tiny Greenfield, New Hampshire. That's a lot of money in a small amount of time for a tiny town like mine, right? So you talked about areas in which you could analyze like cost per pupil. You could look at cost per services per capita. So you had specifically asked a question on how that would translate. This was an example study a community asked me to do when I was a consultant. They wanted to know, I think we want to add 24-hour police protection. So we looked at their whole budget. We did cost per capita, which is a great exercise to do because you can understand how you're spending your resources. And you can imagine they decided not to go forward with 24-hour police protection after the study was done and all the estimated costs were put in. So we did a costing exercise with direct and indirect costs. So if you are considering a new proposal, what does that look like for the service and the cost per capita in your municipality? So that is an interesting way that you could break it down. And you could do cost per capita using the DRA forms and the major categories that the DRA sets out in our account codes is usually the easiest way to do that. Or you can use your each kind of your budget, right? So we usually use cost per student in the school. I suppose you could divide the budget by the population of the community, but the difference is that, in my opinion, the town budget, we serve, before 0 to 110, and the school serves a very specific population. So I think it's kind of measuring two different things, if that makes sense, in my opinion. But I think you could do anything that you like to do, but you do have a reasonable cost per pupil in your community compared to some other communities. Anytime you have,
It allows you a better look at the fixed and variable costs if you do a cost per pupil.
Right, but that is your population you're serving.
Also the science department, something like that.
So you could look at something like that, especially if you're needing to expand a service, it becomes increasingly important to see. But again, you're serving that K-12 education is the legal obligation of the school, but the municipality is to provide a huge array, whether it's water, transfer station, garbage pickup, zoning, planning, you name it, fire, police, ambulance. You have a very different role, a governmental role, I guess I would say. Anytime there's overlapping debt, just because we can have our legal limit of debt service being 3% of our assessed valuation, or 9.75 if we're a cooperative school district, for example, whatever the number is, and they're prescribed by law, the slides are in there. If everyone starts taking out debt and you have 2 village districts, what does that look like for that individual taxpayer? So looking at overlapping debt can start to become important if you're issuing a lot of bonds, or you're starting to see the need to issue debt or more of it. Because just because we can legally do it doesn't mean we can afford to do it. And sometimes when we don't know what someone else is doing, it gets a little bit right? If we're not taking an account, so you're in a great position, you're a budget committee that deals with village districts and schools. So you're seeing all those budgets and you're paying the same attention and doing the same due diligence with all 4 budgets that you would be with one if you were just a town budget committee. So you're kind of seeing the effects if you start to see overlapping debt, right? Fund balance, another great tool, highly misunderstood, not extra money. A lot of times we don't even have it. There are provisions that school districts can now retain. Do you have that provision that you can retain? Up to 5. So that's a contingency fund for the schools, but it is using essentially fund balance for the town. The recommended DRA amount is 5 to 17%, but we always have to look at our cash flow. We have to look at what our needs are, and fund balance really is the tool, the bridge, to make sure that we can meet our obligations. As I said, we collect taxes twice a year. The town is responsible for collecting all of them, and we're legally obligated to pay the school based on their governing body's schedule. The county, we're due December 14th is the county bill is due. Whether we've collected the taxes or not, we have to pay the county. That is our legal obligation. We have to fund our trust funds by December 15th every year. So after the March vote, that is the last time that the last statutory date we can do that. And we know cash goes up and down. Based on your traditional town meeting, the school begins their budget July 1. So school, you don't have to listen to this, but on the budget committee capacity, you might want to. The town's budget starts in January, and you can't spend in light of last year's expenditures up until town meeting, right? That's the law. You can only spend what the town granted you to spend for the same purpose, right? Between January and March till the vote. March, you can start spending whatever the approved budget is. So if they say buy a fire truck, imagine you find one, you can buy the fire truck. We don't collect taxes until June, but we're collecting the second half of the last December. So for cash purposes, any increase in the budget isn't seen until December when they set the tax rate. So the March tax bill gets set in December. Right? So if you had, say, that percentage increase that we saw in the budget and you started spending those dollars, you actually haven't even started collecting that difference, right? And then we collect the second half of the following June. 18 months, our cash has to go. So when we see fund balance and we see numbers of fund balance, and it looks like you're managing fund balance really well in your community, residents sometimes feel like you're overtaxing or you're keeping monies. However, these dollars allow us to have the cash we need because it's 18 months before we collect that difference. And that's if we're collecting 100%. And we never are. So it's an interesting tool, critically important. And anytime we're looking at fund balance, we always want to be very careful with our use of fund balance and not dipping too low. So the town has the cash to operate, because if you take out a TAN note in a high interest environment, a tax anticipation note, you're paying a lot of money for that premium to have cash until you collect taxes. So fund balance is another critical tool, contingency fund. And there are, it's a contingency fund for towns too. Do you have a I didn't see one on your warrant because I tried to look. So it is a contingency fund. If you're starting to really see economic change, you can do 1% of the prior year's budget and it lapses every single year, and you can have it in a fund for any unanticipated expense for the governing body. So if there is a lot of unsuredness around the price of fuel or gas, or there's a lot of debate, or we saw CPI, change from 6% to 1% back up to 6% within 3 months, that scenario can and has happened. Then maybe a contingency fund, the voters approve it, usually use fund balance to fund it, and you only spend it. You have to account for it, but you only spend it. And that could bridge the gap because it's not money necessarily spent. It's only in the event that, some line really goes through the roof that hasn't been accounted for. So that's a financial tool to consider as well. So all these, yes.
You have a formula, you have a formula way of thinking about what would be, appropriate enrollment amount of fund balance for school districts, for the percentage of funding there?
So for school districts, it's called a contingency fund. It's a little bit different. You're allowed to keep up to 5%. And it was 2.5%. The legislature changed it to 5%. School districts are a little bit different in that they get 100% of their obligation from the towns, because the town has to pay whether they've collected the tax or not.
Ask me a different question.
Okay.
So I think my question is, we often discuss that our fund balance is too high in the beginning year, sort of could be correct. So we currently are in the process of budgeting and spending such that we bring that fund balance down.
Oh, okay. I see.
You're gonna have fund balance, it's necessary.
Absolutely.
So is there a formulaic way of thinking about what would be?
Right. So your fund balance goes back to the voters at the school, except for your contingency fund. And for schools, I would have to say that you do need some, it's going back to the voters, right? So that's not the question, but you do need some ability to have cushion for the unforeseen event. If you have one special ed student that moves into your community, that you have to fund that. So whether you think of it as, it wouldn't necessarily over budgeting, but maybe 2%, it would be a minimum, because you have to be able to meet your obligations.
It's a little distinct, but fund balance, what usually happens is we'll take an additional revenue from health, which is our budget for the next following year.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
the board will allocate, let's say, $400,000 from fund balance. Apply to the budget, and at the end of the year, for the fund balance, the board will do that one-time purchases and then put up 5% into, we call it Article 10, which is basically a trust that we can withdraw from the following year again to apply to.
Well, you could only, just like the governing body, you can, fund balance can only be spent within the bottom line of the budget. So you're actually not. So I'm on the board, so I understand what you're doing, because you do have to have the ability to make sure that your obligations are met.
Yeah.
And you do have extra money. You are required outside of that contingency fund to return it all to the taxpayers unless you put it in warrant articles, to your point,
Correct.
where you're using fund balance maybe for capital reserve funds or for other purposes. So what you're doing is exactly what you should be doing, because there's really, with schools, it's just a little bit different, because you're not a taxing authority with that. You collect them. You only set the amount through the budget process. You don't actually collect them. You don't lien property. You don't deed property. You don't go through that process. So it sounds like you're doing it just the way you should be. Yep. So these are just all the other slides that I said I would include. If you wanted to look at, capital appropriations and RSAs, or if you want to look at lapse of appropriations, that everything basically lapses at the end of the year, other than, say, revolving funds, for example, or capital reserve funds. So we did want to thank you and just make sure we can take some of your more of your questions. Oh, one, sorry, go ahead.
You talk about the budget is bottom line.
Mhm.
The bottom line in our budget has been different. It could be the basic operation budget, it could be the total appropriation budget, it could be the amount of taxes that are raised, it could be the tax rate. What is your meaning of the bottom line?
So as far as what you're presenting to the voter, the bottom line budget are the numbers, the physical dollars and appropriations you're reporting on the MS 737 form. So those would be dollars. right?
It would be the total appropriation.
The total appropriations, how you decide on that number using all of what you just said is part of the conversation. What will it do to the tax rate, right? What is the cost per service? All of the different things that you've talked about are part of the discussion, but the bottom line number, the appropriation, because you are what those appropriations are, and then you have your estimated revenue, because no one has a crystal ball. We'd love to, but we don't. That's what you are estimating your taxes on. That number is going to change, but the appropriations won't. So anything you've appropriated is getting taxed on, does it, even if you haven't spent it. But if there's more revenues, less revenues, it's going to change the tax rate. So even your estimated tax impact is still based on the prior year because you don't have the information this year. So you can use all of those tools, but you're actually putting a dollar amount of appropriations is the budget committee, is how you're making your final recommendation. Yes.
We talked about the staff that we want to add. Senate. We as a budget committee in the past, and this is just my understanding. We never thought of doing it that way because we thought we had an obligation to really target within the budget, total operating budget, or whether, in speaking with Europe and Padre maybe 10 years ago, we were advised that we really need to target a particular group, like personnel, or whether it was items, they got it, so I just no particular line. But what I'm gathering here is I have told this understanding to do a percentage and be legit, because oftentimes a person in the public was really negative, say, at school, and they're saying, I want 10% cut. And they don't give any explanation or anything. And we had always felt that that's not appropriate.
So there's two things. So the law allows you to take a percentage and cut the bottom line. But
Let's just be clear though, on the form, it all has to be actual dollars.
Yeah.
You can't say 10%.
you can't say 10%. You still have to calculate that out into actual dollars on the form.
Yeah, I heard you.
Right.
said-
So,
Yeah.
but to do your job and to do it with fidelity for your community, you really should be looking and not just arbitrarily coming up with some percentage, because it really does help the community understand, do you feel that this area of the budget is too much? So again, there's the law side that Nate talks about, and then there's what we do in practice and how we do it in best practice. And best practice really would be to figure out where cuts are appropriate or not appropriate, or where increases are appropriate, and bring that to the voter. Because I always say, if I tell the voters we're buying 100 cases of crayons, and I don't do that because I needed pencils, I have to answer to them, right? I have to answer why did I not buy this, or I should have bought that. And when you just cut if you just say cut 10%, which is within your, to do the calculation and put those numbers down, there's not really any narrative to go with it as to why. Because some budgets may be able to have a different percentage of cuts absorbed versus another. And once that budget passes, there's really no direction from the budget committee or the voters for how the governing body is then going to take into account what the voters want. They're just gonna have to pick what they believe are the areas. So you really should be going line by line, but the law, allows for it. So it's, balancing.
I guess I'm hung up on the balancing, and to what extent the budget committee has the authority to in fact micromanage what the select board is proposed. But let's say the select board has proposed a budget for an ambulance of $800,000, which includes $100,000 for new service. The budget committee cuts that $100,000. Is that micromanaging what the select board thinks is the best for the town?
So again, it's a bottom line budget. And the way I think about the budget is that essentially you have a big number at the bottom and a list of authorizations. And everything in between is your best guess of how those things are going to fit in. It may not fit in exactly. And that's why you're allowed under 3210, the select board is allowed under 3210 to move things around. But the intent is to make as accurate as possible an estimate of how money is going to be spent and then that total amount. And that's why, going back to the question over here, the focus shouldn't be on a generalized cut or increase, because that's kind of just throwing a fit. It should be on, okay, how does this affect the policies in the town based on the priorities we've been told by the select board? And that's how that communication, negotiation, dance happens. Does that make sense?
That sounds like you're saying the budget committee can decide the policy for the town, not the select board.
They decide the financial ramifications of the policies you put forth. So unfortunately, this is the most unfortunate recent example that we have, but Croydon it was legal what happened, except for they couldn't meet some legal obligations, but the budget cuts that occurred were legal. They had to have a special meeting.
That was that SB or no?
No, that was
in person?
that was in person, but regardless of that, it is the budget committee's budget. So if you're proposing a new service, it's within their purview to say, well, if you want that service, once the budget passes, if there's a purpose in the budget that you could justify and put the line in, you can do it, but we don't want the budget to be increased by that amount. So it's not really, it's about the budget itself, not the policies you put forward. So are you willing to take something away somewhere maybe to have that policy priority? But it is the budget committee's budget under an official budget committee for them to make the monetary decisions. So hopefully you're making that conferring and having that conversation together as to why the governing body feels that that new program or service or whatever it happens, the item is critical to the functioning of the community, and you can come to consensus on it. But it's not writing policy on, how Neil does his job or who you hire or fire. It's really tying a dollar amount to your policies, and that is in their purview.
How it's spent
Is on the
Yeah.
board, so
not elected. Someone said you can't do this in this area.
correct, unless there's some no means no that took
Yeah.
place. But other than that, no,
Because of salary and so forth.
correct. Yes,
We talked a bit about who presents and how it's presented at the public hearing. Now we moved to the annual meeting of the state of the town. Does the moderator have total control as to how and who presents the budget?
Generally speaking, the budget committee will work with the select board of the town administrator and finance director to determine the best presentation options, and typically the moderator works with them to figure out how to schedule that. What we frequently see is that happens up front, because that's frankly the largest warrant article item that's happening. Technically, the moderator does direct what happens at town meeting, but it should be a collaborative process with town officials, because we all want it to move as smoothly and quickly as possible.
and we've seen many variations, whether it's the budget committee presenting, the governing bodies present, because they usually, have a different role at the town meeting. Sometimes department heads talk about their budgets. I think every community has to develop that presentation for themselves, but there's no, the public hearing is the budget committee's hearing, the annual meeting is everyone's. It's a different flavor of a meeting. There's no statutory authority around it.
And that's a few years past, we have pretty heavy conflict. I mean, how the budget really wants to present the budget, one of the school in town, and the moderator really get into it, what's the finding and whom at this side. And we have, front of the backs. But again, I understand what you're saying, it should be a problem.
Right.
And it has,
Right, and the moderator is charged with running that meeting and doing the business of the day. So I think, again, having conversations ahead of time might be helpful on who's doing what, who's playing what part that day, right?
A lot of this is resolving interpersonal conflicts.
So New Hampshire is experiencing a declining school population.
of students. I read in the Concord Monitor this last Sunday that Hopkinton is down 5% over the last 10 years in students. But other communities like Franklin are experiencing a 26% students. So looking at it from the standpoint of the budget committee, with us, the tension is that school boards tend to want to hold a level number of staff, and so the numbers of students in the class starts declining. But the budget committee wants to have, an efficient budget and reduce the number of staff to meet that lower number of students over time. So what is the proper role of the budget committee in terms of staff in schools?
So we can't answer, we're not here to tell any one community what they can or can't do, or should or shouldn't do. We're just talking about best practices, because every community is going to experience different trends with enrollment, for example. I will tell you though, when we look at legal obligations and costs, right? It doesn't matter if you're running an ambulance service, you can't run it with nobody, right? You need a certain amount of staff. So you have to look at, and I'm sure this is happening through every school district with declining enrollment. If you're required to have a teacher, if you have 18 kids or 25, you still need a teacher in that classroom. So that doesn't reduce a staff member, right? If you have to teach a certain amount of classes, like reading, writing, arithmetic, will just be pretty basic here without all the
Civics,
extra.
don't forget civics is legally required.
Civics is legally required, maybe a foreign language. It's not one teacher teaching all that. So I'm sure all of that is being discussed and deliberated and debated, but it's kind of like, we have to run an ambulance service and right, you have, or provide some kind of emergency response. And maybe one day we get 20 calls and maybe we can go 6 months without a single call. So do we cut the ambulance budget because we were really lucky? So I think there's so many little nuances that we have to look at, but just the general statement of enrollment or lack of calls for the ambulance might not be enough compelling evidence to make a significant change or cut. You need other data that would support that.
Based on the questions we received tonight, I'm guessing there may be a conflict between what the school board thinks is appropriate for staffing and what the budget committee thinks is for staffing, and we are not going to provide a recommendation.
Yeah.
Hey, you're an ex of this year. It was a 10-year time frame,
Yeah.
and it was a 5-year time.
But separate and aside, I think you spent considerable years discussing sort of this on the one hand, we're going to move the bottom line. There should be a reason for it, otherwise it becomes arbitrary and kind of we're not doing our job because we're elected to try to, have a check and balance and another set of eyes on the budgets of the government projects. On the other side of it, we issue that all of a sudden we're going to be the ground up and recreating or doing the items or doing the work. So these I see as the two extremes, and it's I think the struggle has been trying to find the goal into what is, appropriate level of examination which justify our project without micromanaging, but also doing our job. And I think that's how I see that.
I think that was an excellent summary of what I've heard tonight.
The struggle, I think, in good faith.
Mhm.
I think everybody involved.
And that's, I think that goes back to one of the first things that Catherine mentioned, which is a lot of this is about communication, cooperation, and the relationship between all of the officials, select board, budget committee, department heads, and really working towards not only presenting a budget that the voters will accept, and designing that budget throughout the year in the process, but also working really hard to make sure that you have those open lines of communication and that relationship building between the various bodies and various members so that you can get to that goal.
Yes,
Can you explain more of the state of the tax, how that's determined what it is? Because it basically flats up a little bit, down a little bit, money never leaves the town. What determines?
okay, so, sure.
This is her favorite question recently.
Yes, recently, I get this often. So the statewide education tax is a broad-based statewide tax that every taxpayer pays. It is equalized on a statewide level. And then by your assessed valuation, we could probably find the slide if you want. So there's two, we have the State Education Trust Fund that partially funds inadequate education, which we know that number is now different based on a court ruling, or potentially different if that is upheld. And the Education Trust Fund has money coming in from business profits tax, business enterprise tax, the lottery. It has monies coming in from quite a few different.
There's 12 different sources.
12 different sources, right? Meals and rooms. Anytime you rent a car, there's a percent that goes into the Education Trust Fund. So that trust fund has a certain amount of dollars in it based on those taxes that are non-property taxes. And then SWEPT is assessed to make up the difference for the adequate education grant. However, if your SWEPT money that you collect is in excess, and we have the RAND case, but of the adequate education grant, you don't get adequate education grant. So nothing comes out of the education trust fund. If you don't collect enough SWEPT, you do get an adequacy grant. So they all kind of interplay. It's a little bit, the tax is quite complex. The excess SWEPT, if the 34 communities that were able to keep excess SWEPT from 2010-12 on, when they changed how that formula worked, those dollars are collected locally. The state does a warrant, just like you would see for your taxes, and the state does a SWEPT warrant. They do that equalized valuation. They then apply it to you, make a tax rate for your community, and the number has been based on $363 million the last couple of years. But there's more to that conversation in a second. So it gets apportioned out, and the tax collectors collect the dollars. If you were one of the 34 communities that had excess SWEPT, and I don't know if you're on that list or not, you're not, okay. Yeah, they were able, it actually didn't get transferred over to the schools. It got kept locally and offset the municipal budget. So now we have the RAND case and we have that decision. So we'll probably see a change. Now, several years ago, the legislature saw fit to give a one-time property tax reduction in the form of SWEPT tax by reducing the $363 million that had to be collected in SWEPT to $263 million, with $100 million reduction that would be seen by all of us. So what did that do? It dipped the tax. However, if you were a property poor community and you didn't collect enough SWEPT, and that did happen to some of our communities, well, Berlin residents, for example, I believe had like $177,000 in tax relief. The school budget had to make up $1.2 million. So it just flip-flopped on the tax bill. So SWEPT is in the formula, and that whole thing is complicated. So we are looking forward to seeing what happens, whether the cases are upheld. We'll have to wait and see. We don't really have NHMA doesn't really get too involved in education funding, other than we want it to be reasonable and proportional.
You can tell Catherine's an optimist because she's looking forward to seeing what happens.
I think all taxpayers are going to be looking forward to seeing the outcome of how these decisions, if they're upheld, they have been appealed, will translate in how the state will choose. As the legislature has to act on it.
So the state, is the SWEPT added to the state education tax, some kind of number, a particular town? Is there a target that a particular town gets?
So the adequacy aid is determined by the school budget and the number of students in the school budget. And now the formula just changed again. So now free and reduced lunch is part of the calculation. I can send you some documents that have your community in it, and it might make a whole lot more sense if you're looking at all the different piles of money and how they come in and out for your community. Because the statewide education tax is to help make up the difference in adequacy aid, but it doesn't always work out that way, depending on the community. So yes. So I will send you a spreadsheet and you can share it out. I will send it to Neil. He will share it out with you and you can see how the formula just changed. And they did try to bring in things like free and reduced lunch, hold harmless. No one was supposed to get necessarily less than they got for the next several years. So I'll share with you the new formula and you're going to see all the different piles of money and how they all interact. And then you have to apply it to your assessed valuation and then the school tax rate. And then that'll paint the full picture. It's a complicated topic.
Just so you probably do not have a crystal ball, but, if Conval is upheld, like, what are the leading theories for how, I think I saw like $500 million.
So yeah, $500 million. The state would have to figure out how to come up with that on their side of the calculation. So there are a few different options. Either they could essentially raise their tax and presumably the local tax would go down, so it would be kind of a wash. We may prefer, or they could move money from someplace else. For instance, they could cut all state money to municipalities, as one senator pointed out to us. In which case, they find that amount, but as we talked about with your budget, it's not going to increase any school budget. So you'll see a decrease on the local school side tax, but there won't be any money for roads and bridges. There won't be any money for sewer. There won't be any money for anything that comes from the state, period.
But let's just talk about that. Our highway block grant statewide that we get, so we'll talk about our basic state aid, is $34.6 million, not $500 million.
Right.
Our meals and rooms tax for 1 year is $130 million, apportioned out based on population. Not $500 million. I mean, they would have to pull from.
But even if they add everything up, they get to municipalities.
It won't be enough.
It won't be enough.
We don't have an opinion. We don't have an opinion. We don't do education. Well, I do, but that's a different hat. I have to take it off. I have to take that hat.
I think the second slide.
Not necessarily popular at the legislature.
So we'll see. I think realistically, probably we're not going to. I would say we're probably going to see a lot of disagreement this year at the legislature on what to do. I would imagine as this goes through appeal process, the Supreme Court will issue a stay, which means that we won't have to do anything this year. But that means that whichever side gets the majority in November, whatever their solution is probably going to be the solution the state goes towards, because it will be 2020, the 2025 budget cycle that will be, the state will actually have to grapple with this.
Right. And of course, it's always important, all the articles that I've been seeing, to note that we're talking about budgets. Regardless of the funding source, the appropriations don't change. Whatever the school board decides is the budget, and then the budget committee, in your case, is the budget, regardless of what the state gives or does not give now or in the future. The school budget is still the school budget. So it's right that everyone's like, oh, my taxes will go down if the state gives more. So we're trying to make sure that narrative is made very clear that it's the budget, and we'll have to see what the funding source is before we can make those kinds of generalized statements. Because right now, even if they, should I say it out loud? Even if they legalize cannabis, not enough revenue. Nothing.
I did
Nothing.
the fiscal note on cannabis. The first year, my estimate of the state revenues was $900,000. So.
because it costs. So we're not gonna see, we'll have to see a real big change on that at the state.
Does the municipal association offer any advice to the state legislature or to the income tax, sales tax, solve anything about?
No, we do not have,
Position on that.
no, our members, you all set our policy as our members, you all vote what we bring forward, what we advocate on. We have a general
So we expect to see someone from Hopkinton there
Yeah.
on April 1st.
To tell us
First,
to tell us
To,
how
uh,
to advocate.
tell us what solution we should come and tell the legislature about.
But we do have a general policy around education that we want to see it funded fairly and, appropriately, but it's pretty vague because the schools, as you've seen, we follow about 500 bills this session so far that are coming out between the two of us. There's 500 bills that will follow. And if we were into the school stuff, that's another 200 to 300 bills on top of the municipal bills. So we don't tend to get into that too much, but they're all very much intertwined, certainly. But the school boards and the superintendent, there's other associations that follow that a little more closely. But if our members tell us to have a position on funding, or if the legislature asks me to explain how SWEP works, I pull up my computer, I show them the spreadsheets, I give them charts and graphs, because it's information, it's just education. But we don't have any positions, or I show them where they can find what they're looking for.
We'll make sure to let Neil know when we start our committees so that he can.
So you guys
he
can join
see
us.
which one of you draws the.
I did last year for finance.
Oh, that's right. You were with us on finance. So if education funding becomes something that, because of where we're at, right, with these critical decisions, then that's up to our members.
I guess it's sort of getting off
That's okay.
topic, But I thought I had heard that the potential way to fill that $500 million gap is bringing the interest and dividends tax rate back up to where it was, and the business profits tax rate up to where it was.
The two combined where they had been historically at their highs might do that, but I don't see personally, based on our experience of the legislature, I don't see that happening, bringing those taxes back. But that could be, as we don't have any idea what they're thinking, and we're not in session right now, so we'll have a lot more. Yeah. And we do report in our bulletin when they're, we have on our final bulletin, those charts around anything major that impacts everybody, we certainly report on. So we will report if there's any major information.
Yeah, like, just in the self-education, you mentioned like whoever gains control of the legislature may decide how to fund it. What is the best way to understand what the two sides are advocating for? Like, I struggle to follow the New Hampshire state legislature. I'm sure that since
Every day is different.
where would I just get like a snapshot, like who's proposing what, so I know?
I don't think they've necessarily coalesced, because you have a few different populations. So you have the House and Senate, and each one of them has Democratic and Republican leadership. But also within those two groups, I'd say the Senate's probably more united. Still only 24 in total, but in the House, like among the Democrats, you also have Republicans, officially organized. Among the Republicans, you have the House Republican Alliance, the Majority Leader's office, Speaker's office, and then also the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, Libertarians. And so each of them might have their own idea, and they do a lot of behind the scenes negotiating. I mean, I've seen some things, you've seen some things in the paper, but
Talking to your rep and creating a relationship with your elected officials, your senator, your representative, the people you've elected is really the best way to not only hear what are they hearing and what is their sentiment, whatever party they're in, however that's determined. But it also would allow you to maybe share what you're thinking and feeling. And we have, in our experience, limited experience, but the legislators do want to hear from their constituencies. They do want to hear what's going on. Even when we're not always on the same page, maybe we bring things to their attention that they didn't think of, conceive of, or implications. So creating relationships where you can pick up the phone and call a legislator and they know who you are, can really help you understand some of what you're trying to understand or bring forward some what you think or collectively what your community thinks about some policy that may affect you, whether it's the school or the town. Like I said, with 500 bills on the school side and 200, 300 on the school side, there's a lot of information.
Do you want to plug one thing? We are going to ask you for, but I totally forgot.
I have it.
Tonight. You have it. She has it. She's prepared for everything.
I have a big briefcase.
Once again, we have a wonderful anti-lobbying NHMA bill, so we are trying to get select boards to sign off on a letter that says we do nice things for our communities, and that they should vote to kill this bill. Catherine is more prepared than I am.
I will provide Neil a copy of the letter. You can deliberate if it's appropriate for your community to sign that. But basically, it would not just be us, it would be school board association, teacher, anybody, town clerks, tax collectors, building officials, any association would be prohibited from lobbying, not private industry. It's important to know, just public, local government, basically.
I was gonna add too, every Friday during the legislative session, there's an excellent legislative bulletin that comes out, and it's on NHMA's website, which is a good update, and I had to try to remind people and send out an email so you can sign up to receive it into your box. It's really helpful.
We also have a tracking tool called Fast Democracy. If you go on NHMA's website, it's free to anybody, school, it doesn't matter. You can track and follow bills. You don't have to subscribe or sign up for anything. It's free. If you choose to, you can follow a particular bill weekly or daily even. And it's broken out by town department. So you can follow anything that we're following, and it updates every 4 minutes. So, yeah, our email is like thousands of emails a day about what's happening with a bill. So if there's something that you're particularly interested in, or your departments might be particularly interested in, we have it now set up. So it's town clerks or tax collectors, planning board, zoning board, maybe governing body might want to look. I have finance bills, so anything with a finance implication, whole lot of those. So you can look at it different ways. So it's another way. And again, you can just go to the website and click on the tab. You don't necessarily have to sign up, but if you do, it's completely free.
And I suggest you do narrow it down because I didn't.
Yeah, and you got 20,000 emails.
20,000 emails, yes.
Yeah, so, yeah, so, so education, training, and advocacy are certainly our main roles, and we're always happy to answer questions. At NHMA, we have our business cards, but you can, you're all, our members, you can call us anytime. That's what we're here for. We have our legal services. We have myself around all things finance. So that's our job, is to answer your questions all day, every day.
Thank you for having us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, we had a good time. Thank you. Great question. That the applause should be for you guys. I really do want you to take away how high functioning you are, right? We do see all sorts of different configurations of towns and committees, and you have great information. Your community has access to great information. Even the debates and deliberations and the questions that you're asking, you're really doing everything really the right way. So I think you should really be really proud of yourselves that there's no legal, nobody's out of compliance, and there's no any issues at all. And you're even doing things really well. When I can go online and take a slide that I might use as an example and find your example already on your website that you're already doing, I think that really shows that you really have it together, and your community is doing great things, and your residents and constituents will really benefit from the work that you all are doing, even when it's difficult and hard decisions have to be made. So that's it.
Just like
Those are awesome. I read it. They're great.
the hard copy is set it out. There's also reaching that much.
Well, we have a lovely community. People yelling at them.
Good night, Debbie.